They built ziggurats before the world had pyramids. They wrote poetry before the prophets found words. And then, they vanished. But how does a civilization, one that gave us time, writing, cities, simply disappear into dust? Who were the Sumerians? And why does almost no one remember their name? In the southern cradle of Mesopotamia, long before Rome dreamed of marble or Athens debated the soul, there was a people who carved eternity into clay. They tamed floods, charted the skies, and taught gods how to speak. They invented civilization, but left behind more questions than answers. This is not just their story. It's ours. The first chapter we forgot we wrote. To those returning, thank you. You already know what we're building here. If you're new, ask yourself this. Would you ignore the last surviving voice of a civilization that once defined the world? Because that's what this is. A chance to remember what history tried to bury. Subscribe now, without hesitation. And if you won't, then go to the comments. Tell us why. Tell us why this doesn't matter. We'll wait. They came not to conquer but to stay. The land wasn't land. Not fully. And it wasn't water either. It was something in between. Soft, shifting, and alive, like a creature that breathed in tides and exhaled silt. Here, in this vast delta where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the sea, something unthinkable happened. For the first time in human history, people stopped moving. They came with nothing but memory. Wandering families who had known only hunger, following the seasons, the herds, the shadows of storm clouds. But this place was different. Beneath their feet, the black earth held the memory of ancient floods, rich with minerals, softened by water, and dark as obsidian in the morning light. They called nothing by name, but they understood what this place meant. It meant survival without movement. It meant the possibility of permanence. This swampy land, present-day southern Iraq, was where humanity took its most daring step. Not into battle, not into empire, but into stillness. It was here, in the silence of the marshes, that a few reed huts became the first permanent settlement. And that settlement, barely more than a ring of brush fences and mud, would one day be remembered as Eridu. Today barely a mound remains. But 5,000 years before the pyramids, before Athens, before even writing, this mound was something no other place had yet been. Home. The Ubaid people had no kings, no temples, no myths carved into stone. But they had something more powerful than stories. They had the ability to endure. The Ubaid culture, named after the archaeological site of Al-Ubaid, is one of the most under-acknowledged turning points in human civilization. Dated to around 6500 to 3800 BCE, the Ubaid period marks the dawn of southern Mesopotamian settlement. The people built homes out of sun-dried mud brick, modest, single-room dwellings. They raised sheep, cultivated barley, and fished in the meandering channels. But what made them extraordinary was their understanding of water, both as a gift and as a threat. The marshes around them were seasonal. In spring, floodwaters from the north turned the delta into a glittering sea. In summer, the earth baked and cracked under the desert sun. The Ubaid did something revolutionary. They began to tame the flood. Archaeological digs reveal early irrigation ditches, narrow channels dug with stone tools, carrying water to fields just above the floodplain. It may not seem dramatic, but it was civilization's first infrastructure. These people were not engineers. They were survivors. And their decisions, how to move water, where to plant, when to build and where to flee, laid the foundations for every city that followed. Clay tokens, often overlooked by modern audiences, were their earliest form of abstract record-keeping. Spheres, cones, and discs made from river clay, each representing a count of goods like sheep, grain, or oil. They were not decorative. These were the building blocks of mathematics, trade, and eventually, writing itself. These tokens would be stored in hollow clay balls called bulli, which were sealed and marked with impressions, proof of exchange, obligation, and property. It was bureaucracy before buildings. And these fragile pieces of clay, no larger than a coin, were the beginning of something enormous. What's remarkable isn't just that these early people settled. It's how they adapted to an environment most would flee. The southern Mesopotamian delta wasn't generous. It drowned what you built, scorched what you planted, and bred disease in its stagnant pools. But it was rich, if you could read it. The Ubaid learned to move with the water without being moved by it. Homes were built on elevated platforms. Shrines, barely distinguishable from houses at first, grew to hold shared offerings, signs of early spiritual consciousness. By the end of the Ubaid period, the settlements grew more complex. Pottery became standardized and painted, suggesting specialized craftspeople. Grave goods included tools and ornaments, hinting at social differentiation. But still there were no palaces, no empires. Just people organizing themselves not because they were told to, but because they learned it was the only way to stay. And from these small reed clusters came a spark. But the flood was always coming. And so was something else. Not destruction, but memory. Because the people who built here would soon stop using tokens and start writing. And the world would never forget again. There is a name whispered in ruins. A name carved in mud before stone remembered it. Not Babylon. Not Ur. Not even Uruk. But Eridu. The first city. Or so the Sumerians claimed. Kingship descended from heaven. In Eridu it began. The mystery of Eridu is not simply that it came first. It's that it felt first. First to gather, first to raise walls for something greater than shelter, and first to believe that what they were doing might matter beyond the harvest. Located on a slight rise overlooking the southern marshlands, present-day Eridu sits roughly 12 kilometers southwest of Ur, near what is now Tel Abu Sharain. When archaeologists first unearthed its layered ruins in the 1940s, what they found was less a city and more a chronicle in mud. 18 superimposed temple platforms, built one atop another, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years. Why this place? Eridu was not a hub of trade. It sat at no great intersection of land and water routes. But it had something else: mythic geography. The Sumerians believed it was the city of Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and creation. And when you stand at Eridu's site today, surrounded by parched silence, you feel it, not what is there but what was once believed to be. According to Sumerian king lists and cosmologies, Eridu wasn't just the first city, it was the origin of kingship, the divine birthplace of urban time. It's no coincidence that even after it lost political power, Eridu maintained its religious prestige. In Sumerian memory, Eridu was never replaced, only remembered. The first cities were not born of grandeur. They were built one mud brick at a time. Before there were temples of marble or towers of iron, there was mud. The Sumerians did not quarry stone. There was no stone in southern Mesopotamia. Their world was flat, silty, and sun-scorched. But they had the rivers, and they had clay. That simple fact may be the most underestimated trigger of civilization. What nature lacked in raw material, the Sumerians created through form. They took clay, mixed it with water and straw, and baked the idea of permanence. The mud brick was their revolution. It allowed not just walls, but memory. These bricks, soft, rectangular, pressed in wooden molds, were the first units of urban design, like pixels in the first photograph. The bricks were not uniform at first. Early Ubaid structures were modest, rounded huts and small platforms. But by the time Eridu's sacred precinct emerged in full, the Sumerians were shaping standardized bricks, mortared with bitumen, built in exacting courses. They were designing buildings meant to outlive their makers. Eridu's temple grew taller with each generation, not from ambition alone, but from belief that the gods required continuity. Each layer of Eridu's central sanctuary represents more than construction. It marks a ritual rebuilding, a re-sanctification of sacred ground. The people could have expanded outward. Instead, they built upward as if layering meaning into earth. Excavations reveal that with every new rebuilding, the temple became larger, more complex, more precise. At some point, the rebuilding became itself a ritual. This wasn't renovation, it was liturgy in clay. But here's the rarest truth. Many of the earliest bricks bear fingerprints. Not symbols. Not royal names. Just the prints of the people who shaped them. And through those prints, 7,000 years later, we are reminded of a civilization's most sacred decision. That permanence is not about monuments, but about continuity. The act of staying. Of returning. Of building again even after the flood washes it all away. Eridu may never have had the size of Ur or the fame of Uruk. But it had something they would all borrow, the idea that mud could be sacred. That a city wasn't just where you lived, but where you remembered. And as Eridu grew in both myth and mortar, so did something else. Something no one had yet seen. A society of layers, spiritual, social, and soon, written. It was a world that drowned its children. You might wonder, why build anything here? Why not climb higher, settle inland, escape the chaos of flood and rot? But that's not how civilization began. Civilization began in a place where everything tried to wash you away. In the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, the very land that birthed writing and kingship was not stable. It shifted. A delta of marshes and braided rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates spilled into a fan of black silt. It was a place of extremes, drought or deluge, survival or oblivion. And that may be precisely why civilization took root. The great paradox of Mesopotamia is this: the same floods that destroyed homes also gave life. When the northern rains surged in late spring, they swept downriver, blanketing the land in a sheet of sediment and chaos. But when the waters receded, they left behind something extraordinary: new earth. Soil rich with minerals, soft and dark, capable of growing barley tall enough to feed a village. But only if you could time it, channel it, cooperate. Here, cooperation wasn't a virtue. It was survival. And that necessity, to organize labor, share water, and repair canals, would lay the foundation for governance, law, and engineering. In Mesopotamia, civilization wasn't a choice. It was the only response to a natural disaster that came every year. Before they built cities, they built places to speak with the flood. One of the earliest spiritual structures uncovered in Eridu is nothing grand. A small, rectangular building with thick mud walls and a single doorway facing the east. But it's not a home. It has no hearth, no storage bins. What it contains instead are offering pits, simple depressions where early Sumerians left fish bones, barley, small vessels. It's one of the oldest known shrines, and it tells us something critical. Before temples came belief. Before belief came fear. And out of fear, ritual. This shrine and others like it across the delta were not private. They weren't built into households. They stood at the center of early settlements, open to the entire community. And at their heart was a singular idea: that water was not just nature, it was divine. That its cycles of destruction and fertility were not random but governed. And those who understood its rhythms, who could commune with its spirit, could help the rest survive. In Eridu, that spirit had a name: Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and subterranean life. Enki wasn't a god of the heavens. He was of the abyss, the Apsu, the deep freshwater reservoir beneath the earth. His temple was called Iabzu, the house of the watery deep. Water was everywhere, and it was everything. It healed. It drowned. It decided. To the Sumerians, water was God, threat, and salvation all at once. Their entire vocabulary for existence emerged from it. The very word for fertility, abzu, was also the word for abyss. There was no clear line between natural and supernatural. When the rivers flooded too early, it was divine punishment. When they didn't flood at all, it was divine silence. Even household deities, the Lamassu, Ishtaratu, and other domestic spirits, were often invoked with water. Libations poured at thresholds, rituals of purification using reed sprinklers, and cleansing of altars with brackish well water. What's rarely discussed, even in modern historical accounts, is how intertwined water rituals were with early technology. The first canal systems, uncovered near ancient Lagash and Eridu, often terminate near religious precincts. The conclusion? Hydraulic engineering was born not in pursuit of profit, but in service to gods. Water wasn't just an agricultural tool. It was a language, a code, a way to both communicate with and appease powers far greater than any mortal chief. And when the waters returned, unexpected, unforgiving, it was not merely a natural event. It was a cosmic correction. But water would not always listen. And one day the river would come not to bless, but to erase. And when that day arrived, it would bury not just fields, but names. Eridu and the idea of God, midnight. Why build upward when survival meant staying low? At first it was just a room. A room made of mud, lit by fire, brushed with silence. And then, someone stepped inside, barefoot, and left an offering. And that's when the room changed. That's when it stopped being shelter, and became sacred. In early Eridu, the shrine was not an annex of power, it was its seed. What archaeologists found beneath the city's mound was no grand ziggurat, but a sequence of small, humble structures, each built precisely atop the last. At first, the rooms were no larger than a common house, square with a single doorway and a central niche. But they weren't used for sleep or storage or cooking. They held nothing useful, only something essential, symbolism. With every rebuilding, something shifted. The walls thickened. The floor was raised. The room's alignment became more precise. And eventually, around 4500 BCE, that space became something new. No longer a shrine, but a temple. The oldest known in southern Mesopotamia. No other city, not Uruk, not Ur, shows such early religious layering. It is at Eridu where the ritual of rebuilding became institutionalized. And this is key, they didn't build anew. They built upon. Each layer wasn't just clay, it was a memory. An act of remembering in structure. A sacred archaeology performed by those who didn't yet write. The temple faced the sun, not by accident but by design. Its doorway opened to the east, where light is reborn every morning. And in that light, the gods awakened. The east-facing orientation of early temples across Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, and later Nippur was not architectural habit. It was cosmological purpose. In a world where life and death were governed by cycles of light and water, to face east was to face renewal. The rising sun was not just a celestial event, it was a daily act of divine affirmation. The sun god Utu, later Shamash, would emerge each day to judge, to witness, to bless. And so temples opened to him. But the temple wasn't merely a house of the gods. It was a machine of ritual time. Inside, thick walls held cool air. Niches housed clay figurines, perhaps early divine representations, perhaps ancestral spirits. Central hearths or offering basins collected blood, oil, grain. In larger temples, raised altars emerged, elevated with each rebuilding, closer to the divine realm. According to Thorkild Jacobson, one of the great Sumerian scholars of the 20th century, the temple was not just the god's house, it was his body, his presence on earth. In this sense, the layout itself mirrored divine order, symmetry, directionality, sacred geometry. Rarely mentioned in common accounts is the temple's connection to the seasons. Some early temple sites, particularly at Eridu and Uruk, align with solstices and equinoxes. This suggests that even in its infancy, Sumerian religion sought to anchor time through space. A divine calendar made of shadow and sun, measured in doorways and thresholds. But here's what the textbooks often miss. No two temples were exactly alike. Even in Eridu, where ritual dictated alignment, there were small deviations: door width, wall thickness, altar shape. And that suggests something quietly revolutionary. These early temples weren't mass-produced dogma. They were living traditions, changing subtly with each generation, whispered through brick, not declared in stone. And still, something was happening beneath that clay. Something that couldn't yet be named. Because a temple needs priests. And priests need language. And before long, someone would press a reed into wet clay and write the first word. Why build upward when survival meant staying low? At first it was just a room. A room made of mud, lit by fire, brushed with silence. And then, someone stepped inside, barefoot, and left an offering. And that's when the room changed. That's when it stopped being shelter, and became sacred. In early Eridu, the shrine was not an annex of power, it was its seed. What archaeologists found beneath the city's mound was no grand ziggurat, but a sequence of small, humble structures, each built precisely atop the last. At first, the rooms were no larger than a common house, square with a single doorway and a central niche. But they weren't used for sleep or storage or cooking. They held nothing useful, only something essential: symbolism. With every rebuilding, something shifted. The walls thickened. The floor was raised. The room's alignment became more precise. And eventually, around 4500 BCE, that space became something new. No longer a shrine, but a temple. The oldest known in southern Mesopotamia. No other city, not Uruk, not Ur, shows such early religious layering. It is at Eridu where the ritual of rebuilding became institutionalized. And this is key: they didn't build anew. They built upon. Each layer wasn't just clay, it was a memory. An act of remembering in structure. A sacred archaeology performed by those who didn't yet write. The temple faced the sun, not by accident but by design. Its doorway opened to the east, where light is reborn every morning. And in that light, the gods awakened. The east-facing orientation of early temples across Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, and later Nippur was not architectural habit. It was cosmological purpose. In a world where life and death were governed by cycles of light and water, to face east was to face renewal. The rising sun was not just a celestial event, it was a daily act of divine affirmation. The sun god Utu, later Shamash, would emerge each day to judge, to witness, to bless. And so temples opened to him. But the temple wasn't merely a house of the gods. It was a machine of ritual time. Inside, thick walls held cool air. Niches housed clay figurines, perhaps early divine representations, perhaps ancestral spirits. Central hearths or offering basins collected blood, oil, grain. In larger temples, raised altars emerged, elevated with each rebuilding, closer to the divine realm. According to Thorkild Jacobson, one of the great Sumerian scholars of the 20th century, the temple was not just the god's house, it was his body, his presence on earth. In this sense, the layout itself mirrored divine order, symmetry, directionality, sacred geometry. Rarely mentioned in common accounts is the temple's connection to the seasons. Some early temple sites, particularly at Eridu and Uruk, align with solstices and equinoxes. This suggests that even in its infancy, Sumerian religion sought to anchor time through space. A divine calendar made of shadow and sun, measured in doorways and thresholds. But here's what the textbooks often miss. No two temples were exactly alike. Even in Eridu, where ritual dictated alignment, there were small deviations: door width, wall thickness, altar shape. And that suggests something quietly revolutionary. These early temples weren't mass-produced dogma. They were living traditions, changing subtly with each generation, whispered through brick, not declared in stone. And still, something was happening beneath that clay. Something that couldn't yet be named. Because a temple needs priests. And priests need language. And before long, someone would press a reed into wet clay and write the first word. They didn't build new temples beside the old ones. They built on top of them, again and again for over 1,000 years. And in that repetition, they invented memory. In Eridu there are no towering ruins like those of Rome. No marble columns or statues carved from limestone. What we have instead is a mound. A soft, weather-worn rise in the desert, silent and unspectacular. But beneath that humble hill lies one of the most profound archaeological puzzles in the world: 18 superimposed structures, each a version of the same temple, built atop the last like sedimentary devotion. From the Ubaid period to the early Uruk age, each generation in Eridu chose not to abandon, but to rebuild, using nearly identical floor plans, reinforcing foundations, raising the platform higher each time. The reasons were not practical. The site was not structurally superior. In fact, rebuilding on top of old mud brick made later constructions more vulnerable to collapse. Yet they insisted. What was once a modest shrine on flat ground slowly became a raised platform, a terrace of sacred memory. And that act of elevation, unintentional at first, became a ritual in itself. As the building grew, so too did its symbolism. To rebuild was not just to restore, it was to honor what came before. In this pattern, the ancient Sumerians created not only architecture, but the first archaeological consciousness. They didn't just remember the past. They stood on it. And then, one day it was no longer just a platform. It was a stairway. Not to gods imagined in the sky, but to gods who lived among them just above. What began as a low mud brick foundation eventually gave birth to an idea that would reshape the spiritual architecture of the ancient world: the ziggurat. The Sumerians did not build pyramids. They built mountains of meaning, tiered, elevated temples designed not just for visibility but for proximity. The gods, they believed, did not live far away. They lived slightly above. Enough to require an ascent. Not unreachable, but higher. The ziggurat was the Sumerian answer to elevation in a world without stone. No granite. No cliffs. No sacred hills. So they made their own. The ziggurat did not begin as a finished form. Its earliest traces, seen at Eridu and later at Uruk and Ur, are platforms stacked upon previous sacred centers, built in squared levels, decorated in white gypsum or black bitumen. These were not towers of conquest. They were ritual topographies, spaces that mimicked the cosmic axis between heaven, earth, and the watery abyss. Scholars like Henri Frankfurt noted how ziggurats were neither tombs nor fortresses, but something more abstract, a cosmic mediator. In a tripartite world where the heavens, the earth, and the underworld formed a divine ladder, the ziggurat was the middle rung. Not a place of mass gatherings, but of sacred intimacy. Access was restricted. Only priests, those trained in rites and purity, were permitted at its summit. There, under open sky, they performed rituals unseen by the public. And yet, the very shape of the ziggurat told the people below, "You are part of this order. Your gods stand above, but not beyond." What few realize is that the ziggurat's evolution was not merely architectural, it was emotional. With each layer added, each stair carved, the people of Eridu were ritualizing the act of reaching for safety after the flood, for clarity in a world of chaos, for favor in the eyes of a god who controlled not sky or sun, but water and wisdom, Enki, who lived not in the clouds but in the watery deep. It is easy to forget how revolutionary this was. The Sumerians were not building to keep out invaders. They were building to meet the divine halfway. But even this sacred elevation wasn't enough for what was coming. Because soon, the gods would not only demand temples. They would demand order. They would demand accounting. And that meant one thing was inevitable: writing. There was a time when you worshipped alone, with your family by your hearth, whispering thanks to household spirits. Then something changed. One day your prayer required an appointment and a priest. In the earliest days of Mesopotamian settlement, spiritual life was intimate. Every house was its own sanctuary. Clay figurines of protective deities sat tucked in wall niches. Meals began with libations to appease the unseen. But by the time Eridu had risen to ritual prominence, a tectonic shift had occurred. Worship had gone public. The temple, once a quiet shrine, now demanded infrastructure. Offerings measured by weight, days marked by rituals, spaces designated for priests and processions. This was no longer just devotion, it was coordination. And with coordination came control. What drove this transformation was not dogma, it was scale. As Eridu's population grew, so did the stakes of divine favor. A failed harvest wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a civic disaster. Public religion emerged not out of philosophical musing, but economic and ecological pressure. Someone needed to interpret the floods, to appease the gods, to blame or reassure when the fish vanished or the sky withheld its rain. Religion, for the first time in human history, became institutionalized. The temple was no longer a house of prayer, it was a house of power. And presiding over this transformation was Enki, god of wisdom, god of water, god of mischief. Enki is not a god of thunder or fire. He is not a warlord. He is a trickster, a master of invention and subversion. And yet it was he, not the warrior gods, who was worshipped first in Eridu. Enki ruled the Apsu, the vast subterranean freshwater ocean beneath the world. From it flowed not just rivers but knowledge. The earliest myths say Enki gave the divine decrees of civilization. Farming, writing, law, craftsmanship. But not all at once. He withheld, then gifted, then retracted. In one tale he gets drunk and accidentally gives away all the meat to the goddess Inanna. In another he creates humans, then floods the world when they displease the gods. Why worship such a fickle figure? Because Enki reflects the real world. His waters nourish, but also drown. His knowledge enlightens, but also deceives. He is the ambiguity of civilization embodied. The Sumerians didn't need a god of certainty. They needed a god of paradox. And in Enki they found a model for both cleverness and caution. His temple in Eridu Abzu was built not on a hill, but over a sacred pool, an architectural statement that power and truth both rise from below. Modern historians like Samuel Noah Kramer suggest that Enki's stories encoded early political anxieties. How much knowledge is too much? Who decides what counts as order? Rarely mentioned in mainstream retellings is that Enki was also god of reeds and brickwork, materials of both shelter and bureaucracy. It was he who taught humanity not only to survive the flood, but to organize afterward. And so, someone had to speak for the god. Someone who could manage the rites, interpret the omens, weigh the offerings. And thus, the priesthood was born. The rise of public religion brought with it a new class of people. Not hunters, not builders, not chiefs, but mediators. The Sumerian priest was more than a spiritual guide. He was an astronomer, economist, archivist. In Eridu, temple records were among the first uses of writing, not for stories but for tracking offerings and labor quotas. The temple staff kept time with lunar calendars, regulated water usage, and stored grain for redistribution. Moral authority was no longer abstract, it was administrative. One of the most underexplored facts of early Mesopotamia is that the temple and its priests wielded economic control long before kingship emerged. Before Uruk had a crown, Eridu had a tablet. And that tablet said who gave what, when, and why. The line between sacred and civic was porous. Priests became gatekeepers of both gods and grain. And over time they stopped merely representing divine will. They began to shape it. But moral authority, once held, invites rivalry. And in the centuries to come, the priest would be challenged. Not by gods, but by men who would claim they were gods. It didn't begin with conquest, or kings, or war. It began with something far more radical: scale. Because one day the village wasn't a village anymore, it was a world. Around 4000 BCE, a small southern Mesopotamian town near the Euphrates River began to outgrow itself. There was no single founding event, no hero, no manifesto. But year by year, building by building, Uruk became something humanity had never seen before. A city, not a large village, not an extended family, but a dense, organized, multi-zoned urban phenomenon, home to tens of thousands, surrounded by canals, protected by walls, and ruled by a force more powerful than any one man: coordination. By 3400 BCE, Uruk had expanded to over 250 hectares, making it arguably the largest city on Earth at the time. The city pulsed with noise: potters, textile workers, canal diggers, temple administrators, barley counters. For the first time in human history, people lived in a built environment they didn't personally construct. A weaver in Uruk might never meet the man who dug the irrigation canal, or the priest who offered grain to Inanna, goddess of love and war. But they all relied on each other. This was not just settlement, it was civil complexity. And with scale came awe. Not just in number, but in stone. Uruk didn't just grow. It lifted. The city's explosion demanded space. And that space demanded structure. What Eridu had experimented with, elevated temples and platform shrines, Uruk perfected and weaponized. The Inanna precinct, dedicated to Inanna, was nearly 500 meters long, a temple complex larger than most villages. Built from millions of handmade mud bricks, adorned with cone mosaics and buttressed walls, it towered over the city like a second ziggurat of memory and ambition. But this was not just religious devotion. It was political theater. The act of building became a display of control. Not merely over the divine but over labor, time, and resources. Uruk's builders invented mass labor coordination, organizing thousands to haul clay, shape bricks, raise walls. Their walls, such as the famed Wall of Uruk described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, stretched for kilometers and required an authority strong enough to commandeer months of labor from people who weren't family. This was new. This was revolutionary. Architecture was now power made visible. And still the people stayed. Not because they were forced, but because something in Uruk offered security, meaning, and participation. Here, for the first time, you could be a citizen, not just a kin member. A priest of Inanna, a scribe of barley, a brewer for the temple. Identity became occupational, not ancestral. That shift would echo for millennia. But how do you manage a city that no one person can understand? How do you feed 40,000 people, track their offerings, organize their days? You invent the most dangerous tool of all, writing? Writing, in its earliest form, was not for literature, poetry, or laws. It was for counting. The first tablets of Uruk, dating to around 3300 BCE, record shipments of beer, sheep, fish, and labor assignments. Early Sumerians used pictographs and numerical counters on clay tags sealed in clay envelopes, called buli. These evolved into tablets. From this humble origin emerged cuneiform, one of the longest-lasting writing systems in human history. Rarely taught today is that the Uruk period was not literate in the way we understand literacy. Writing was controlled by a narrow elite, scribes trained in numeric and lexical signs. Their clay tokens and signs became the infrastructure of abstraction, tracking debt, offerings, and temple labor across generations. In effect, writing invented accountability. You could now be measured, stored, and remembered by an institution. Writing became the conscience of the city. But this writing did more than store numbers. Slowly it began to hold names, then titles, then prayers, then myths. And once the gods could be written down, they could be standardized, ranked, and used. Something sacred was becoming strategic. And not everyone agreed on who should hold the pen. The priesthood, once caretakers of shrine and field, now found themselves embedded in a system they no longer entirely controlled. Urban life brought administrative challenges that demanded new types of leadership, ones that could negotiate land, judge disputes, punish crime, and even lead armies. Priests prayed. But who would protect? The answer was not immediate, but tensions were rising. For the first time in Sumerian history, secular power began to emerge beside sacred power. What had begun as a religious city was becoming a political state. And someone would eventually have to stand at its head, not with a scroll but with a weapon. Who would speak for the gods? Who would speak for the people? And what happens when they're not the same person? To rise toward the heavens was not hubris. It was memory stacked high. Because in Uruk, the sacred did not vanish into the sky. It stayed here, built brick by brick. Towering above the city of Uruk was one of the first monumental ziggurats ever conceived, a stepped mountain of man-made origin. The structure wasn't simply tall. It was layered. Each terrace marked a stage of divine ascent, mimicking the mountains from which their gods were once believed to descend. Unlike later pyramids sealed in death, the ziggurat was a living axis, meant to bridge the terrestrial with the celestial. The Great Ziggurat of Uruk, likely the earliest in Mesopotamia, stood at the heart of the Yana district, the sacred precinct of the goddess Inanna. Archaeologists have uncovered at least 18 construction phases at the site, with platforms layered upon older ones, a ritual of continuity across generations. Each layer reasserted the city's cosmic alignment. The ziggurat was always aligned to the cardinal points, especially east, to greet the rising sun. The temple atop was not for the masses, it was for the god. Or for the one person chosen to speak with the god, the high priest or ruler. Here's something rarely discussed. Beneath many ziggurats, including Uruk's, archaeologists found ceremonial tunnels and water channels, suggesting rituals that involved not just ascent, but emergence. These were not merely monuments, they were ritual machines staging cosmic reenactments of life, death, fertility, and renewal. The temple atop was small, but its influence immense. In Uruk, the gods didn't just watch from above. They were hosted. And that hosting required precision, repetition, and brick. And while towers rose toward the divine, another revolution unfolded in silence, in the cool back rooms of temples on clay. Cuneiform, the world's oldest writing system, was not born out of poetry. It was born out of panic. With the city swelling, offerings increasing, and temple economies expanding, memory alone was no longer enough. What began as clay tokens for sheep and grain soon turned into pressed marks, then symbols, then language. By 3200 BCE, Uruk scribes were transforming commerce into code. But the leap from numbers to narrative was not inevitable. It was intentional. Early cuneiform tablets speak in the language of accountants, columns of quantities, pictographs of commodities. Yet among these ledgers, something extraordinary happened. Names appeared, then actions, then prayers. One of the oldest surviving stories, the Kesh Temple hymn, praises 7 temples and may have been an early attempt to unify Sumerian religious identity through song. And then came the Epic of Gilgamesh. First in scattered lines, then compiled centuries later, the story of Uruk's semi-divine king, his friendship with Enkidu, and his search for immortality became the first literary self-examination in human history. Uruk did not just build itself in brick. It wrote itself into being. And in doing so, it taught humanity how to remember beyond death. Most viewers have heard of Gilgamesh. But what they haven't heard is that the earliest versions didn't center on heroism. They centered on loss. The death of Enkidu, the grief of the king, the failure to conquer death. Even in their first use of literature, the Sumerians didn't celebrate themselves. They questioned themselves. What kind of power is worth having? What kind of legacy survives? In a city where stone towers reached the sky, the most lasting structures were words pressed into clay. But as cities like Uruk flourished, the question wasn't just how to build them. It was who would own them. Civilization isn't built by stone or script. It's built by people agreeing, sometimes silently, sometimes under pressure, on who does what and for whom. In Uruk, the division of labor wasn't just practical. It was ideological. Unlike villages, where roles blurred and survival was shared, the city required permanent specialization. Some made bread. Some dug canals. Some served the gods. Some could never leave the kiln. One recent tablet from the late Uruk period lists over 100 distinct professions, from seal engravers and metal workers to harp players and omen readers. But this wasn't equality. It was order, rigid, assigned, and often inherited. Farmers lived on the city's edges, bound to the irrigation cycles. Brickmakers worked in blistering pits under temple quotas. Slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors, were listed in temple ledgers as property. The elite? They occupied shaded courtyards near the ziggurat, managing inventories of cattle and oil, their names pressed into clay by scribes who themselves formed an emerging bureaucratic class. This wasn't just a city, it was a machine. And at its center was a belief that labor was sacred. To serve Inanna wasn't metaphor, it meant pressing barley, baking sacrificial bread, preparing beer jars to exact standards. The line between ritual and routine blurred. A shepherd might never set foot in a temple, but his wool would drape the statue of a god. In Uruk, every action fed a purpose larger than the person. The city ran not on steam but on faith and function. It began with tokens, simple clay counters shaped like the things they represented. A sheep, a jar. But soon these symbols weren't just things. They were stories. The first Sumerian accounting tools were three-dimensional, tokens placed in hollow clay envelopes, bully, each sealed and marked to prevent fraud. These weren't primitive, they were contracts. The problem? You couldn't see what was inside without breaking the seal. The solution? Press the token shapes onto the outside. And from that small act of abstraction, writing was born. But what's often missed is how quickly these tokens stopped being about actual goods and started recording ritual obligations. One tablet from Uruk lists not just quantities, but the name of a deity receiving them, the person responsible, and the moon phase. Myth, time, divinity, all layered into what began as a ledger. In Sumer, myth didn't replace accounting. it grew from it. The gods became the ultimate creditors, and the world itself became a balance sheet. And over time, as scribes gained power, these tablets began to include judgments, omens, curses. Stories of gods who punished broken contracts, kings who ruled by divine measure, floods sent for moral failure. Numbers became narratives. Clay became scripture. And out of balance came belief. Uruk was not the final form. But it was the first time humans constructed a world that outgrew any single mind. A place where thousands could live together, and not know each other, yet still believe in the same stories, obey the same gods, and follow the same ledgers. But that belief had a price. Because when a city runs like a machine, what happens when someone tries to control the gears? What happens when words no longer die? Before the gods were written, barley was. Before epic, there was inventory. And before civilization could dream, it had to count. The invention of writing wasn't a moment, it was a drift. A drift from symbol to sound, from object to idea. In the dense temple economy of Uruk, where grain-filled warehouses and cattle rotated between altars, memory reached its limit. Clay tokens, once the bookkeeping backbone of trade, were too slow, too bulky. Someone had to make memory portable. So they pressed images into tablets. The first writing wasn't poetic. It was pictographic. A fish for fish. A jar for oil. But around 3100 BCE, something revolutionary happened. The signs became abstract. A triangle wedge might mean portion in one tablet, to divide in another. Meaning was no longer fixed. It depended on context. Thought had escaped the object. And that is where civilization took a leap. This new system, what we now call Proto-Cuneiform, quickly evolved. By 2900 BCE, scribes began arranging wedges into patterns that represented not just things, but actions, names, and ideas. The first ideograms were born. Soon after, phonetics crept in. A sign might represent a syllable, not a sheep. And what began as accounting, transformed into the world's first script. They wrote of beer, not of battle. Of rations, not of kings. Their first priority was survival, and their second was the record of it. The earliest surviving tablets, most from Uruk and later from Jemdet Nasser and Nippur, reveal a quiet revolution. These weren't royal declarations or prayers to the gods. They were ration lists. One of the oldest texts on earth details beer allowances, measured in sela, roughly a liter, for different workers. Some received 5 sela, others 3. The inequality is clear even then. Other tablets list oil quantities, grain disbursements, and even the labor output of temple workers. In these ancient ledgers, we see the birth of something more than writing, we see administration. A city's ability to outlive any one human brain. Some tablets even included the month and day organized by lunar cycles. This was time structured and shared. And behind these records stood a silent class. Their names rarely mentioned, but their hands shaped empires. These were the scribes. To master cuneiform wasn't a skill. It was a vow, a lifetime, a mark of elite memory. In cities like Nippur, the scribes trained in adubas, tablet houses attached to temples. These were not open schools. Admission often depended on family status, wealth, or temple patronage. Inside, boys spent years memorizing signs, replicating model texts, and copying contracts word for word. Punishments for mistakes were harsh. But the reward was power. Cuneiform literacy meant control. A scribe could read property deeds, interpret legal judgments, or invoke ritual formulas. They were the glue between the divine, the royal, and the economic. Some even rose to become court advisors, priests, or temple administrators. In a culture where 90% of people were illiterate, scribes held the keys to immortality. And though the Adubas taught rote repetition, a few scribes did something unexpected. They invented. They wrote letters in their own voices. They recorded dreams, incantations, and sometimes, subtly, sarcasm. One tablet from Lagash contains a letter of complaint. A scribe demands better rations and accuses the temple official of stinginess. Even 4,000 years ago, bureaucracy had its critics. Cuneiform was not a dead language. It lived for 3,000 years, longer than the alphabet has so far. It was passed from empire to empire, from Sumer to Akkad to Assyria. And every time the clay hardened, memory became permanent. But in the next hour we'll ask a harder question. What happens when memory meets power? The world's first books weren't sagas or prayers. They didn't sing of gods or men. They counted. Long before the Epic of Gilgamesh or hymns to Inanna, the earliest Sumerian texts told a different story. One of barley, labor quotas, animal herding, and temple expenses. These first books were not for reading. They were for remembering. And they were brutally efficient. Each tablet was a ledger. Each symbol a line item. In the city of Uruk, one cache contained over 1,200 tablets, almost all of them receipt-based records. One in particular reads like a grocery list from a divine household. 2 sela of beer for the man who brought the sheep, 5 for the priest, 1 for the courier. If writing was a tool of power, then accounting was its handle. These texts weren't meant to inspire, they were meant to control. But to run a temple or a city, numbers alone weren't enough. You needed a system that could scale. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing. They invented the way we think about numbers. And they didn't count by 10, they counted by 60. Welcome to the sexagesimal system. While today's world revolves around base 10, Sumerian scribes built their mathematical world on base 60, a number system that still haunts us. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. A circle has 360 degrees. These aren't random. They're ancient echoes of the Sumerian mind. Why base 60? Scholars believe it was because 60 is highly divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and more. It made calculations cleaner, fractions neater, and trade smoother. Tablets from Nippur reveal multiplication tables, geometric progressions, and even exercises in square roots. These weren't just scribbles, they were curriculum. And though their numerals looked like little more than angled wedge marks, the math they carried reached far beyond the field. In time it would stretch into the heavens. To the Sumerians, the sky wasn't just stars, it was a schedule. And time wasn't circular. It was written. From the high ziggurats, temple priests recorded the movements of the moon and stars, not for wonder but for order. Planting seasons, tax collection, festival days, all depended on celestial timing. The Sumerians developed lunar calendars that grouped months by the moon's cycle, and later added intercalary months to correct drift, an early form of calendar reform. One rare tablet from Ur, over 4,000 years old, lists the visibility of Venus, marking its rise and disappearance across the horizon. Another, discovered in Sapar, maps the moon's phases against offerings to specific gods. Astronomy wasn't science in the modern sense, it was divination through precision. But make no mistake, this was abstract thought, structured, repeatable, and recorded. Time, once oral and fluid, was becoming fixed and shareable. And with it, the universe itself began to take on grammar. At some point, someone did something strange. He wrote down a story not for record, but for memory. The transition from oral tradition to written cosmos happened slowly and almost invisibly. First came ritual incantations, standardized, repeated, now committed to clay. Then hymns. Then royal inscriptions. Then a myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the debate between sheep and grain, and the instructions of Shurupak, all born from a culture that had finally turned sound into sight. This wasn't just transcription. It was translation, from breath to permanence, from voice to script. What had once depended on priests, elders, or bards could now outlive its speaker. Sumerian scribes didn't just preserve history, they froze the cosmos in clay. And what's more, they knew it. One scribe from the city of Lagash left this line scratched on the edge of a tablet. "I have written this. Let the gods see it. Let my name live." It was the beginning of authorship, and the start of something far more dangerous. The power to speak without being present, and to command from beyond the grave. Before we go any further, a quick word to those of you who've been here since the first scene. Thank you. You're part of the rare few who refuse to let history fade quietly. You already know this story deserves to be remembered. But for those watching and not subscribed, ask yourself this. If these Sumerian voices could survive 4,000 years in clay, what's stopping you from clicking one button to keep this story alive? This content takes hours of research and days of writing, so if you're still watching but not subscribing, then be honest. Drop a comment and tell us why. We dare you. But if you're the kind of person who understands that history only lives when we pass it forward, then don't wait. Hit subscribe. Right now. Let's finish this story together. Why would gods that created life demand so much death? In Sumer, the divine wasn't distant. It breathed through architecture, ritual, and even bricks. At the heart of their cosmos stood the sky god, distant and unmoved, pure heaven itself, rarely active but always present. Beneath him, Enlil, god of air and storm, ruled like a divine tyrant whose breath could birth kingdoms or tear them down. Then Enki, the cunning master of the freshwater deep, trickster and civilizer, shaping humanity not with force, but with invention. And finally Inanna, goddess of sex, war and power, whose presence danced at the boundaries of chaos and beauty. These weren't just gods. They were forces. Each one anchored a layer of reality, and was unreachable sky. Enlil was the command between heaven and earth. Enki was below, where the subterranean abyss, the Abzu, housed life's secret blueprint. And Inanna? She refused boundaries. She blurred the roles of male and female, lover and killer, kingmaker and destroyer. This cosmic arrangement wasn't mythology in the way we understand it. It was architecture. A structure of power, invisible but absolute. They believed the world didn't run by accident. It ran on something ancient, invisible and terrifyingly real. The me. The me, a concept barely understood even now, was the Sumerian term for the fundamental laws of the universe. Not legal codes. Not religious commandments. The me were existential blueprints, abstract forces encoded into reality itself. One me governed kingship. Another regulated agriculture. A third dictated how mourning was to be done. There were me for song, for prostitution, for silence, for lying, for truth. They weren't suggestions. They were divine programming. One of the oldest surviving myths, Inanna and Enki, tells of the goddess tricking her uncle Enki into handing over these me, stored like sacred software in the depths of the Abzu. Drunk and distracted, Enki gives them freely. When he sobers up, it's too late. Inanna sails them back to Uruk, and with them brings the force of civilization to her city. The myth, strange and half-finished, reveals something unsettling. The gods could lose control of the very architecture they created. This idea, that power once transferred cannot be undone, haunted the Sumerian imagination. And from that tension, their cities, rituals, and entire culture were built. Faith, to the Sumerians, wasn't a comfort. It was survival. To ignore the me was to risk unraveling the thread of existence itself. Every temple was a simulation of this cosmic order. Each rite reenacted the divine architecture. Every offering was a negotiation with chaos. In Nippur, the spiritual capital of Sumer, the great temple of Enlil stood not just as a house for a god, but as a hub for cosmic order. Priests were not preachers. They were engineers of balance. Ceremonies weren't worship. They were maintenance. Even kings obeyed the rhythms of the me. A ruler who defied the sacred order might find his city plagued, his reign cursed, his legacy erased. This wasn't metaphor. Sumerians believed the collapse of civilization began the moment someone violated the divine design. They didn't fear gods as much as they feared forgetting the rules that kept the gods satisfied. This belief, rigid, fearful, precise, created the first civic religion. One not built on personal faith, but collective obedience to a higher pattern. And in that fear, they found order. But what happens when the pattern is stolen, or rewritten, or broken? That question would change the course of Sumer forever. And as kings began to rise from clay courts and build thrones and temples once ruled by priests, the age of the divine blueprint would give way to the age of human ambition. To the Sumerians, the gods didn't just demand obedience. They demanded reenactment. Ritual was not symbolic. It was binding. Every major city in Sumer had its own temple complex, but in Uruk, seat of the goddess Inanna, ritual took on a scale that blurred the lines between liturgy and politics. The sacred marriage rite, one of the most enigmatic ceremonies in the ancient world, occurred annually during the New Year festival. A high priestess representing Inanna would ritually unite with the city's king, performing a physical act meant to secure agricultural fertility, divine blessing, and royal legitimacy. But this wasn't mere performance. Cuneiform hymns, such as those attributed to Enheduanna, the world's first known author, described the rite in breathtaking and unsettling detail. The act was believed to bind heaven and earth. The king became Dumuzi, Inanna's consort, the priestess, the goddess herself. Their union wasn't just metaphorical, it was considered cosmological engineering. If they failed, the crops might not grow. The floods might not recede. Order itself might crack. And so, every gesture, every drumbeat, every word chanted was loaded with terrifying consequence. Even the city's layout was designed to funnel energy toward the ritual. Processions moved along sacred avenues in choreographed rhythm with the seasons, aligning the human world with the heavens. But even goddesses must descend. Of all Sumerian myths, none is more haunting, or more revealing, than the descent of Inanna. It is one of the oldest religious texts on earth. And unlike heroic epics or moral fables, it offers something much rarer, a theology of death, duality, and psychological rupture. The tale begins with Inanna donning her divine regalia, 7 sacred items of power. With each step into the underworld, she is stripped of one. At the 7th gate, she stands naked and silent before Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. She is judged, killed, and hung on a hook. For 3 days and nights the world falters. Crops wither. Temples fall silent. And then, by trickery and negotiation, Inanna returns, changed. But here lies the mystery, she does not return alone. Her resurrection requires a substitution. The myth ends not with triumph, but with transference of suffering. This wasn't just a religious tale. It was cosmic truth to the Sumerians. Death is not erased, it is relocated. Scholars have long debated this myth's deeper meanings. Some call it a fertility allegory. Others see it as proto-feminist myth-making. But what's often overlooked is the psychological depth, the radical suggestion that even gods must face disintegration to achieve rebirth. Inanna's journey was performed ritually in temples, her descent acted out by priestesses during seasonal festivals, reinforcing the belief that life depends on sacrifice, and that no power is without its cost. To rise you must fall. To rule you must die. To be remembered, you must be reenacted. The Sumerians lived inside these paradoxes. And in doing so they didn't just build temples. They invented the psychological blueprint for every religion that would follow. In Sumer, death was not the end. It was a contract, signed in soil and sealed with offerings. For the Sumerians, the body was not simply disposed of. It was returned deliberately into the care of chthonic forces. Burials beneath homes were common. Yes, beneath the very floors families walked on daily, turning every household into a domestic underworld. Other graves were communal, placed in sacred precincts like the royal cemetery at Ur, where dozens were buried with lyres, jewels, and attendants. Some sacrificed, suggesting not just social hierarchy but spiritual choreography. These weren't graves. They were performances of cosmic memory. Each burial was a subtle message to the gods. We remember. We obey. We release what was yours to begin with. Grave goods reflected this exchange. Jars of beer, tools, combs, cosmetics, all meant to help the soul navigate the darkness of Kor, the Sumerian underworld. It wasn't a place of torture, but of silence, where forgotten names disappeared forever. That's why remembrance was power. To forget a name was to kill it again. The divine had coordinates. Sumerian cities weren't accidents of settlement. They were cosmic models. Every structure, palace, courtyard, gate, existed in dialogue with the sacred. The division between the sacred and profane wasn't just theological, it was urban design. Temples stood at the center not only physically but symbolically, anchoring the city in mythic geography. From their high platforms, priests observed stars, measured time, and dictated the agricultural calendar. Streets were laid out to mirror celestial alignments. Temples had east-facing doors to greet the morning sun, each dawn a ritual. Even drainage systems had meaning. Canals and runoff pathways mimicked the divine rivers Tigris and Euphrates, linking human waterworks with Enki's watery domain. Crossing thresholds meant something. A gateway could be both literal and spiritual. When one entered the sacred zone of a ziggurat, they weren't just entering a building, they were stepping into a different realm. Modern archaeology has revealed even ritualized topographies. Spaces used only for funerals, others only for processions, some hidden from public view entirely. Sumerian life was designed so that movement itself became worship. To journey was to remember. Pilgrimage in Sumer was not mandated, but it was transformational. People traveled to holy cities like Nippur or Uruk, not for trade, but to anchor themselves to the myths that gave meaning to their lives. These were often seasonal journeys, timed with festivals aligned to celestial events. In Nippur, for instance, thousands gathered for the Akita festival, marking not just the new year, but the renewal of divine order itself. Sacrifice, both symbolic and literal, sealed these pilgrimages. Animals were offered, libations poured, songs recited. But sometimes what was sacrificed was less obvious. Time, distance, and identity. A farmer could leave his land and become a pilgrim. A woman could sing the verses of Inanna and temporarily become a vessel of the goddess. These acts created community through myth, not through blood or birth, but through shared memory, ritual, and repetition. These stories were not just told. They were walked. They were enacted in dust and sweat, along roads that still exist beneath the modern cities of Iraq. Their echoes remain, in broken boundary stones, in carved votive offerings, in the fingerprints left on clay by hands that believed that somewhere between heaven and the underworld, the gods were listening. To build cities was to write stories in earth. But soon they would find a way to write in stone. And memory itself would become law. When the gods' granaries failed, the people starved. To serve the gods was to feed them. To feed them was to rule. For modern minds, the temple is a place of prayer. But in ancient Sumer, the temple was also a factory, a bank, and a bureaucracy. The gods had estates, vast ones. Their temples owned fields, orchards, herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, workshops of weavers, brewers, and metal workers. And while the gods were symbolic owners, the priests, human caretakers of divine needs, managed it all. They created what historians now call the temple economy. This economy was not capitalist, not socialist, but something altogether older. Goods didn't circulate in a free market. They were stored, counted, redistributed. A farmer paid grain not to the state but to Ningirsu, the local god. A fisherman's catch might be smoked and preserved for the god's table, or distributed at festivals. Temples employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers, all supported by this divine redistribution system. It was faith and economy fused in brick and oil. The gods wrote everything down. Or rather, the priests did. Just outside Nippur, archaeologists uncovered what is arguably the oldest archive of economic data in human history. This is Drahem, or ancient Pusrishdagon, an administrative hub built solely to track the movement of animals. Here, over 30,000 cuneiform tablets record every transaction. Oxen for sacrifice, sheep for ritual meals, goats for festivals, donkeys for transport. Some records list the priest overseeing the herd, others the day it arrived, even the weight and health of the animals. The detail is astonishing. One Drahem tablet, no larger than a postcard, might note, "On the 7th day 12 fattened sheep delivered for Enlil's offering by Lunana, inspected by ur-Lugul." Some even include the destination, perhaps the kitchen of a high temple or the home of a priestess. This wasn't just religious devotion. It was logistics, management, and inventory control 2,000 years before the Roman Empire. And behind every transaction, a worldview, that the gods had needs, that their hunger was real, and that if the balance was not maintained, chaos would return. In this logic, the priest wasn't a spiritual guide, he was a divine accountant. And mistakes could offend the cosmos itself. But what happens when the god's house grows too hungry? The next section will explore the politics of the priesthood, land ownership rivalries, and the tension between palace and temple. But for now, we're left with the image of a civilization where every prayer was also a payment, and every temple was a ledger in clay. To serve the gods was to serve the system. For many Sumerians, religion was not a matter of belief. It was a matter of occupation. The temples didn't simply receive offerings, they produced and did so at an industrial scale. In cities like Ur and Lagash, the ziggurat loomed over neighborhoods of weavers, brewers, potters, tanners, and shepherds, all tied to temple workshops. These weren't small cottage industries. Temple records list as many as 1,200 full-time weavers under one god's household. That's not just devotion. That's a textile industry, and one of the oldest recorded in history. Weavers spun fine wool, dyed in deep indigo and saffron, used for priestly garments or traded with Elam and the industry brewers, many of them women, produced barley beer for daily rations and ceremonial banquets. Shepherds ranged miles beyond the city, managing temple herds that numbered in the tens of thousands. Each worker received measured grain or oil in return, logged carefully by scribes. In these dusty tablets, you can trace the birth of employment, the shift from communal duty to professionalized labor. Not for wages but for rations and rank. The temple did not just feed the people, it ruled them. In Sumer, the temple wasn't just the largest employer. It was also the governor, registrar, and courthouse. The priests, acting as stewards of the divine household, wielded vast influence over land tenure, taxation, and justice. Property disputes between farmers? The temple heard the case. Accusations of theft from the grain store? The priestly tribunal passed judgment. Births, marriages, and deaths were often recorded through temple scribes, binding the rhythm of life to the realm of the divine. This created a powerful feedback loop. The more land and labor the temple controlled, the more authority it claimed over law. And since gods were eternal, temple property was considered permanent, a legal fiction that outlasted kings. As one inscription from the reign of Uruk Revolution declares, "The priest has eyes, ears, and tablets. He forgets nothing." To live under temple rule was to live in a system where justice was sacred, but also unyielding. The line between morality and administration blurred. A late payment wasn't just an offense to the state, it was an offense to the god himself. And if the god was angered, everyone would pay. But what happens when the ledger becomes more powerful than the law? Not all temples had altars, some had cradles. When we picture the Sumerian economy, we think of scribes, priests, and ziggurats. But behind the metrics of livestock and grain lies a quiet workforce that rarely made it into official records: women. In temples across Sumer, women didn't just serve as wives or mothers. They were weavers, brewers, perfumers, and priestesses. Some temples functioned almost like cloisters, where women lived communally, received rations, and worked under divine obligation. Their tasks were essential: fabric for trade, beer for ritual, incense for the gods. Yet in most tablets they appear not by name but by quantity. Still, fragments survive. In the archives of Lagash we find tablets detailing female weavers of the goddess Bao, listed alongside production quotas and oil allowances. In Uruk, women brewers helped supply barley beer for both daily rations and festival libations. This was the invisible economy, carried out by hands that never signed their work, yet shaped every cloth the priests wore and every offering the gods received. Their labor kept the machine of the temple humming, silently, faithfully. And then, a woman did something no one had ever done before: she wrote herself into history. Her name was Enheduanna, and she was more than a priestess. She was the first known author in the world. Appointed by her father, Sargon of Akkad, as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur, she stood at the intersection of political conquest and religious continuity. To stabilize his new empire, Sargon placed his daughter at the helm of the most sacred cult in Sumer. But Enheduanna wasn't content to serve silently. She composed hymns to Inanna, full of ecstatic rage and celestial awe. In them she addressed the goddess directly, not as a distant ideal, but as a cosmic force who could destroy kings or bless empires. Her voice was lyrical, raw, and commanding, queen of all the me, clad in allure, riding on the great divine powers. She wasn't writing for one generation. She was engraving herself into eternity. Her tablets have been found as far afield as Nippur and Uruk, recopied for centuries after her death. In Enheduanna, we glimpse something unprecedented. A woman who not only led ritual but shaped theology, who not only served power but wielded it through words. She turned the temple into a platform, and for the first time in recorded history, the personal became political through poetry. But when the gods ruled the storehouses, who ruled the gods? In Sumer, the lines between church and state didn't exist. They coiled around one another. The temple was not just a place of worship. It was the anchor of political authority. Priests mediated between human laws and divine will, and cities often functioned as theocratic corporations, with the gods as CEOs and kings as their earthly managers. Decisions about land, justice, trade, even war, were wrapped in ritual. Before a campaign, omens were read. Before a tax was levied, it had to be justified as sacred obligation. And yet, Beneath this fusion of sacred and civic, there was tension. Kings wanted autonomy. Temples held memory. Rulers rose and fell, but the priesthood endured. In many Sumerian cities, temple lands were exempt from royal control, and priests could challenge decisions through divine sanction. A king might build a canal, but if the gods weren't consulted, or worse, offended, the priests could turn public opinion by declaring divine displeasure. This uneasy balance is echoed in the tale of Lugal-Zagizi, a high priest who became king, only to be overthrown by Sargon. Or Gudea of Lagash, who wrote dozens of inscriptions declaring that every brick he laid had been approved by the gods. He wasn't just pious. He was protecting his legitimacy against both political rivals and divine retribution. The temple was never just a building. It was a body, a brain, a memory, and a mirror. What do you do when the man who speaks for God also owns the army? The river never forgets where blood was spilled. When the summer rains failed and canals dried to cracked silence, Sumerians didn't just pray, they marched. In the hot dust of Mesopotamia, where a king's authority was measured not in gold, but in grain and water, war became an extension of irrigation. And somewhere around 2900 BCE, the gods no longer ruled alone. Now men did too. The early dynastic period marks the first time the cities of Sumer weren't just clusters of shrines and workshops. They were militarized, walled, and led by rulers who called themselves Lugal, meaning great man. This wasn't myth. It was bureaucracy fused with blood. Inscriptions from Lagash, Amma, and Kish show us the outlines of these early states. Regional strongholds with standing armies, grain rations for soldiers, and walls reinforced with fired brick, one of the first known uses of military engineering. Before Achilles there was ur-nammu. The stele of the vultures, carved around 2450 BCE, stands not in a museum of myths, but in one of military history. Found in Gursu and attributed to ur-nammu of Lagash, it depicts the earliest recorded battle scene in human civilization. And it doesn't whisper. It roars. On one side, orderly phalanxes of spearmen move like a machine, shoulder to shoulder, helmeted, uniformed, and deadly. This was not disorganized tribal skirmishing. This was military doctrine. Scholars believe this tight infantry formation, hundreds of men advancing as one, predates similar Greek strategies by over 1,500 years. On the other side of the stele, vultures fly off with the heads of the dead, an omen and a warning to future enemies. This stele doesn't only glorify victory, it standardizes it. The enemy city of Amma had violated a water treaty, a conflict born from canal rights, and ur-nammu responded not just with swords, but with law, backed by divine legitimacy. He claimed the war was ordained by Ningirsu, god of war and irrigation. In this act, theocracy fused with monarchy, bloodshed was justified as divine irrigation of justice. But some gods didn't walk. They rode. The earliest war chariots emerged here, crude two-wheeled carts pulled by onagers, wild donkey-like beasts, before the domesticated horse. Unlike the sleek chariots of later Egypt, these were slower and more symbolic than tactical. But they still changed everything. Mounted warriors could move quickly between city walls and canal embankments, carrying messengers or slinging javelins. Recent studies of cylinder seals from Ur and Kish show elite warriors riding in these carts, wielding spears and axes, their hair braided tight, a mark of status, not just readiness. To control a chariot was to control the terrain. These weren't common soldiers. They were the prototype of the aristocratic warrior, fast, mobile, terrifying. It's no coincidence that kings began to equate their rule with speed, vision, and thunder. And thus the Sumerian king was born, not chosen by men but proven by steel and sanctioned by gods. The first war in history wasn't fought over borders, it was fought over water. In a land where rain rarely visited and the rivers were both savior and executioner, control of water wasn't just practical, it was sacred. The fields of Sumer drank only what the canals allowed, and so, unsurprisingly, the first recorded conflict in human history was not over conquest but canal rights. The contenders? Lagash and Umma, two neighboring city-states locked in a rivalry that would echo across centuries. The spark was an ancient boundary, a strip of land known as Guadina, the edge of paradise. This fertile corridor between the Tigris and Euphrates was managed by a complex irrigation system, and both cities laid claim to it. Clay tablets from the time, particularly those from Lagash, speak of repeated trespasses by Umma into this disputed zone, often interpreted as the first written accusations of territorial violation. But what made this conflict extraordinary was not just its cause, but its documentation. The kings of Lagash etched the entire grievance and its resolution into stone. The Treaty of Mesolam, dating to around 2550 BCE, stands as the first known peace treaty in recorded history. Issued under the authority of King Mesolam of Kish, who acted as arbiter, it delineated the boundary between Lagash and Umma using canal markers and divine witnesses. The gods were literally invoked as guarantors of peace. But treaties like the rivers could erode. And when Umma's ruler later violated the agreement, the war that followed was chronicled on the steel of the vultures, not only as a victory but as an act of divine retribution. A new word appears in the tablets, Lugal, not a priest, a king. Before armies, Sumer was ruled by Ensi, priest governors who served as stewards of the temple and the land, intermediaries between gods and people. These figures, though powerful, drew their legitimacy from ritual and order, not warfare. But the canal wars changed the logic of leadership. Temples alone could not defend city walls. The god's voice now had to share the throne with the sword. It is during the late early dynastic period that the term Lugal, literally big man, emerges with force. This was not just a title. It marked a seismic shift in political structure, from temple-based rule to militarized kingship. While the Ensi continued in religious roles, the Lugal was the man who could organize soldiers, command engineers, enforce treaties, and, when necessary, break them. Lagash's ruler Eannatum, often cited as the first true Lugal, embodies this transformation. He wasn't merely a warrior. He was a strategic planner who recorded troop movements, canal defenses, and grain allocations on clay. His records refer to enemies not as heretics but as violators of contracts, emphasizing law as a weapon. His wars weren't just about glory, they were about order, water, and the practical management of civilization. The Sumerians didn't just invent kingship, they wrote the rules for ruling. What emerges from the rivalry between Lagash and Umma is not merely the memory of war, but the foundations of geopolitics. Treaties backed by third-party mediators, the use of divine authority in legal enforcement, canal diplomacy, and the permanent marriage of sacred and secular power all begin here. And yet, something fragile lingers beneath all this. The canals that sparked bloodshed could also be clogged by neglect or broken in retreat. Civilization here was both an achievement and a gamble. It was not armies or temples that made Sumer great. It was the desperate, tireless attempt to tame a land that could kill with thirst or flood. In a land of mud and reed, how do you prove that you're king? You build something no one can ignore. In Sumer, stone was rare, but ambition was not. So rulers reached for permanence using what they had: baked brick, gypsum, lapis lazuli, copper, and fire. Monumentality became a language, a claim, a threat. Temples swelled into ziggurats. Royal walls stretched for kilometers. And steel, Towering slabs of stone etched with battle scenes rose like thunderbolts driven into the earth. The Stele of the Vultures, commissioned by Eonatum of Lagash around 2450 BCE, is not a neutral record. It's propaganda in limestone. One side shows the king marching his phalanx in tight formation, spears forward, eyes straight. On the other, he stands as a giant beside the god Ningirsu, gripping the net of captured enemies like caught fish. No written edict could match the raw intimidation of this image. This was violence made divine and made public. And it worked. These monuments didn't just glorify the ruler, they warned enemies, awed allies, and bound subjects to their city's destiny. Each brick stamped with the king's name was a whispered reminder, I was here. I ruled. I conquered. In the absence of printing presses, this was mass communication, carved into the very infrastructure of daily life. No war could be just without a god's permission, and no king could be king without a war. Sumerian kings rarely framed conquest as ambition. Instead, they invoked divine sanction. Before a campaign, they sought omens. The liver of a sacrificial sheep might determine the fate of a city. A king might postpone battle if the stars were unaligned, not out of superstition but out of real fear, that conquest without divine approval was a curse in disguise. Texts like the Sumerian king list don't simply list rulers and reigns. They map power as something handed down, literally, by the gods. The phrase kingship was lowered from heaven is not metaphor. It was understood as fact. Even when kings acted ruthlessly, they justified their actions by claiming the will of gods like Enlil, god of wind and kingship, or Ningirsu, patron deity of warfare and justice. This divine license wasn't taken lightly. Kings who defied the gods, or who lost their favor, were remembered as warnings. When the Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin declared himself divine in the centuries ahead, a drought and invasion followed. Later scribes blamed his hubris. This wasn't simply mythology, it was political commentary. Divine favor wasn't a right, it was a test. When you mix gods and power, you don't just rule cities. You rule meaning itself. The period between 2500 and 2300 BCE marked the birth of political theology. This was more than temple rule, it was statecraft built on sacred myth. The Lugal was no longer just a warrior or administrator. He became the chosen vessel of divine order. His decrees weren't policy. They were, quite literally, the voice of the gods in motion. In Uruk, kings presided over elaborate religious pageants where they reenacted mythologies, not as actors but as living embodiments of deities. The king became Dumuzi, the dying god of fertility. The queen priestess became Inanna, goddess of love and war. Their sacred marriage, the Hieros Gamos, was both theater and theology. Citizens watched as power was spiritualized before their eyes. This wasn't accidental. The merging of religion and kingship allowed early states to create emotional legitimacy. Subjects obeyed not just out of fear of soldiers but out of awe. Rituals, architecture, myths, all merged into a single logic. To disobey the king was to disrupt the cosmic order. And so, the city became a cosmos in miniature. The palace, a throne of heaven. And the temple, its beating divine heart. And yet, beneath all this splendor, a new storm gathered. Kings who thought themselves gods. Empires that would rise not for the gods, but in spite of them. Can memory outlive the man who made it? He built walls that touched heaven, but they could not hold his fate. This is Gilgamesh of Uruk, not the mythic hero of legend, but a real man who lived around 2700 BCE. His name appears in the Sumerian king list, and even an archaic inscription proclaims him chosen by Utu, the sun god. When death claimed him, locals are said to have diverted the river to bury him beneath its dry bed, an unheard-of gesture suggesting both fear and awe. This was no ordinary mortal. Even in his own time, Gilgamesh was regarded as kingship incarnate. Gilgamesh emerges not from myth but from plan and polity. As king of Uruk, one of the largest cities in early Sumer, he likely oversaw major building campaigns, including the walls whose remains archaeologists still trace today. Legends about him circulated orally in the royal courts. Feats against monsters, journeys of rescue, divine ancestry. These tales were not static. Court singers retold them in festivals, marketplaces, processions, each performance adding layers, embellishments, memory. Over centuries, 5 independent Sumerian poems, such as Gilgamesh and Enkidu, were composed, each focusing on one episode: a heroic duel, a forest quest, a descent into the netherworld, a great flood. These fragments, preserved in fragmentary tablets, attest that the story was alive long before it was written. Even in early dynastic scribal schools hundreds of years later, children copied verses about Gilgamesh, not as myth but as cultural substance. The transition from oral saga to literary epic began amid the Old Babylonian period, around 2000 to 1500 BCE. Multiple Akkadian versions circulated, each offering a slightly different ending, tone, or episode sequence. Then, between 1300 and 1000 BCE, the scribe Sinleki Anini compiled the standard Babylonian version, a 12-tablet epic titled He Who Saw the Deep. Gilgamesh could not escape death. But through words he conquered oblivion itself. Before Enkidu met Gilgamesh, there were no legends about kings being challenged. There was no mirror to power. Enkidu was born of earth and clay, shaped by the gods not for glory but for balance. He ran with gazelles, drank beside wild bulls, and shielded the forest from hunters. He was the untamed answer to a king too proud. In that sense, Enkidu didn't just challenge Gilgamesh's rule, he challenged the very definition of civilization. But Enkidu could not remain wild. He was brought into the city through a carefully orchestrated ritual, one that involved the temple priestess Shamhat. Over the course of days he was not only introduced to sexuality, but also to food, beer, and language. His animal companions rejected him, and his body grew heavy with awareness. This was not just about making him human, it was about severing him from the natural order. Enkidu's transformation was Sumer's message to itself. Nature could be broken, reshaped, and taught to kneel before the temple. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is not just the first great literary bond. It's a mirror of a deeper shift in human history. Gilgamesh, a ruler with no equal, meets his match in a being who has no titles, no temple, and no fear. Their friendship is forged through combat, sealed in shared victories, and tested in acts that provoke the wrath of the gods. Together, they slay Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and kill the bull of heaven sent by a rejected goddess. These acts do not go unpunished. Enkidu is chosen to die, and with his death, the narrative itself fractures. Gilgamesh, once the embodiment of strength and purpose, is undone. He weeps not just for his friend, but for the part of himself that now knows what it is to lose. Enkidu's dying curse, against the temple, the hunters, the woman who tamed him, tells us that this grief is not clean. It is jagged, uncivilized, and profoundly human. Gilgamesh's grief becomes a quest, not to restore Enkidu but to escape death itself. He wanders the world, meets immortals, crosses rivers of death, and begs for the secret of eternal life. But when he finally obtains the plant of renewal, he loses it. A snake takes it, sloughing its skin, a quiet reminder that rebirth belongs to nature, not men. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk not with eternal youth, but with memory, and the realization that walls endure longer than kings. He asked the gods for more life. they gave him a story instead. What if the oldest story in human history ends in failure, yet leaves behind something greater than victory? In a forgotten chamber far from the glory of Uruk's stone walls, Gilgamesh meets the one man who defied death. Ziusudra, known later by the Akkadian name Utnapishtim, is no hero of conquest. He is a man who survived the gods' wrath not with a sword but a boat. His tale, centuries older than the Book of Genesis, was carved in clay long before parchment held the name Noah. In the Sumerian myth, the gods decide to wipe out humanity, not for wickedness but for noise. The world had become too loud. Enlil, the god of air, sought silence. But Enki, the god of wisdom, whispered the secret to Ziusudra through a reed wall. "Build a boat," he said. "Measure it precisely. Seal it with bitumen. Bring animals. Bring seeds. Bring the memory of the world." The flood came fast. It raged for 7 days, and when it ended, the world had been rinsed of its future. But Ziusudra endured. The gods, stunned by his survival, offered him what they rarely give: life without death. Yet when Gilgamesh meets him, this supposed immortal is no beacon of hope. Ziusudra lives at the edge of the world, weary and removed. His gift is exile. Immortality has made him unrelatable. His wife bakes bread that hardens into stone over days, each loaf meant to mark the passing of time while Gilgamesh sleeps. By the time he wakes, eternity has already slipped through his fingers. The flood survivor teaches him that outliving death is not the same as defeating it. Gilgamesh's journey is unlike any other hero's. He is not seeking gold, revenge, or territory. He is fleeing the very thing that makes him human: death. What makes the Epic of Gilgamesh endure is that its protagonist fails. Not by accident but by design. He scales mountains, crosses oceans of sand, and passes through tunnels of total darkness, only to find that the answer to his question is no. There's a quiet cruelty in the moment Gilgamesh gains the plant of eternal renewal, only for it to be stolen by a snake while he bathes. He doesn't lose it in battle or sacrifice it for someone else. It slips away while he lets down his guard. The symbolism is dense. The snake, which sheds its skin and renews itself, becomes the rightful heir of the immortality Gilgamesh was denied. Rebirth, it seems, is a cycle for nature, not for men. When Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, it is not as a god, but as a king with a new burden. He will die, but the city will remember. Mortality is no longer his enemy. It's his medium. He inscribes his story in stone, not to deny death, but to outlive it another way. That is where the Epic of Gilgamesh transcends time. Not because it promises salvation, but because it shows how storytelling became the oldest human form of survival. The most haunting line in the entire poem was not written to console. It was carved to warn, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Though popularized by Shelley thousands of years later, the original sentiment belongs to a king who watched his glory begin to crumble. The irony is profound. Gilgamesh built Uruk's mighty walls, and it is those walls he points to at the end, not his victories. He knows his body will be dust, his deeds forgotten. But the written word, the carved name, might echo. What's often overlooked is the medium itself. Gilgamesh's scribes wrote in cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay. It wasn't just a script. It was architecture. Durable, heavy, and unburnable. While papyrus decayed and parchment tore, clay tablets endured earthquakes, floods, and wars. When modern archaeologists uncovered Nineveh's library, they didn't find scrolls. They found the clay whispers of kings long turned to ash. And in those whispers we find Gilgamesh. Not as a myth, but as a man who feared the silence that comes after life. His tale was passed from oral bards to scribes, from Sumerian to Akkadian, from ruin to museum. The irony is that by accepting death, Gilgamesh achieved a form of life no god could give: cultural immortality. He lives not in heaven but in every language his story has touched. His gods could not save him. His story did. The world gets bigger but more fragile. Before nations, before dynasties, before kings ruled worlds, one man did. His name was Sargon. And he changed everything. He began not as a prince but as a cupbearer, a servant to a Sumerian king. But Sargon, whose name means true king, would defy the limits of his origin. According to a later Akkadian myth, he was placed in a basket of reeds and cast down a river, a striking parallel to the story of Moses, but older by over 1,000 years. Whether fact or crafted legend, the myth reveals how Sargon's rise was seen: miraculous, ordained, and dangerous. By the mid-24th century BCE, Sumer had grown rich but fragmented. Each city-state, from Lagash to Ur, had its own ruler, its own gods, its own agenda. Sargon saw opportunity in chaos. Launching from the relatively obscure city of Akkad, whose precise location remains one of archaeology's great mysteries, he conquered the great city of Kish, a symbolic gateway into southern politics. From there, Sargon moved like a storm. Uruk, ur-nammu, all fell under his rule. The king who was once an outsider became the architect of Mesopotamia's first empire. But conquest alone does not make an empire. Sargon did something few before him dared. He installed Akkadian governors, not just soldiers. He replaced local rulers with loyal administrators, placed family members in critical cities, and standardized the use of the Akkadian language across the south. This was more than strategy, it was identity building. The Sumerians had given the world writing. Sargon gave them a political center. A new idea was born: one king ruling many lands with a message that stretched beyond borders. What allowed Sargon to hold his empire was not just vision but discipline. He restructured the military into something the ancient world had never fully seen: a standing army with logistical support, unit divisions, and centralized planning. Gone were the days of loosely aligned citizen militias raised per campaign. Sargon's soldiers were professionals, fed from state granaries and moved like precision tools across hundreds of miles of territory. He also introduced innovations that made large-scale warfare sustainable. Roads were maintained between cities to allow rapid troop movement. Military governors doubled as civil administrators, ensuring both tribute collection and loyalty. Perhaps most shockingly, he was one of the earliest leaders to deploy psychological warfare. One stele proclaims, "In every place where I set my foot, I left my name inscribed." His campaigns weren't just about land, they were about memory. Every victory became part of an imperial narrative. Yet Sargon's administration was not purely martial. He understood the language of law, commerce, and belief. He ordered the compilation of land records, taxation ledgers, and trade inventories across regions. He treated conquered elites not as enemies, but as tools to be reshaped, marrying his daughters into regional priesthoods and co-opting religious structures. One daughter, Enheduanna, became high priestess of Ur and composed hymns that re-centered divine focus toward the empire. Religion was no longer only local, it now served the state. And still there was resistance. Uruk rebelled twice. Sumerian scribes continued to write in their native tongue, even as Akkadian crept into official documents. But Sargon understood that real power wasn't total. It was tolerated, maintained not by love but by fear and usefulness. His empire was not the end of the Sumerians. It was their pause, their interruption, their reshaping under northern rule. He was the first to conquer the four corners of the world. But even the first empire fades. What survives is the idea. To rule a land is to inherit its tongue, but to keep it, you must teach your own. After conquest, Sargon didn't erase Sumerian culture. He absorbed it. The Akkadians, speakers of a Semitic language related to Arabic and Hebrew, did not destroy the script of the Sumerians. Instead, they borrowed the cuneiform writing system, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay, and adapted it for their own spoken language. This was no small feat. It was the first time in recorded history that a writing system crossed linguistic boundaries and began functioning for multiple languages. The result? A bilingual empire, not by tolerance but by necessity. The names on clay tablets from this era tell a story of layered identity. A merchant might have a Semitic name like Iluabi, God is my father, but write his business transactions in Sumerian. A priest might chant in Sumerian but pray in Akkadian. In temple schools, future scribes had to master both tongues to qualify for government service. This was the beginning of a bureaucratic elite, multilingual, multi-ethnic, and loyal to the empire. While Sargon himself claimed divine favor and military genius, his true genius was institutional. He codified multicultural administration long before the term existed. Beneath the surface of conquest, what emerged was not a simple dominance of one people over another, but something more layered, a cultural hybrid. A system where Sumerian literary prestige coexisted with Akkadian administrative language. Over time, the scribal class became living bridges, their fingers fluent in two languages, their minds trained to translate not only words but systems of thought. This bilingual synthesis would echo for over 1,000 years, influencing the libraries of Babylon and the learning of Assyria. But how do you govern an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, across mountain passes and marshy plains? The answer was infrastructure and information. Under Sargon's reign, and later that of his grandson Naram-Sin, a rudimentary postal system was developed. Archaeologists have found clay tablets stamped with official seals and addresses, packed into protective envelopes of clay, some with receipt marks confirming delivery. Couriers likely moved between city-states on foot or on donkey, following known roads and resting at pre-designated relay points. This wasn't just for trade, it was surveillance. The state began tracking deliveries, maintaining archives, and issuing top-down orders to local governors, effectively turning clay into command. Even more remarkably, multilingualism wasn't confined to the scribes. Royal inscriptions from Akkad appear in Sumerian, Akkadian, and occasionally Elamite, demonstrating early awareness of diplomacy and the strategic use of language. By controlling both the medium and the message, Sargon's regime created an empire of shared reference points. Everyone didn't have to agree, but everyone had to understand. Unity was not sameness. It was orchestration. This imperial coordination had unexpected consequences. For the first time, artisans in distant provinces began replicating motifs from Akkad. Cylinder seals from Mari, in modern Syria, began to bear the same divine symbols as those in Lagash. Even fashion and hairstyles, once deeply regional, became standardized under Akkadian influence, turning visual appearance into a political statement. In this way, Akkad became not just a city but an idea, a place you might never visit but one that reached you all the same. Sargon built more than walls and armies. He built a system. And once a system knows how to speak, it never forgets how to rule. When Lugal-Zagizi of Umma stood crowned as the final unifier of Sumer before Sargon, he believed he had inherited divine legitimacy. His inscriptions claimed dominion from the lower sea to the upper sea, a poetic boast that extended his reach from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But Sargon of Akkad didn't just defeat him. He paraded him in chains through the gates of Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer, a symbolic assassination of Sumerian autonomy. What fell wasn't merely a king but an era. The collapse of Lugalzagizi's reign was not a quiet political defeat. It was a rupture in the ancient order. The temple priesthood alliance that had governed Sumerian city-states for centuries was upended. Akkadian rule didn't just change the names in office, it reshaped the very grammar of power. Sumerian culture became a tool rather than a master, preserved only where it served imperial control, in ritual, record-keeping, and mythology. The myth of Lugalzagizi's divine mandate was shattered, and with it, the last breath of an independent Sumerian polity. The city-states would never again stand alone. In that moment, empire became irreversible. Even Sumerians who opposed Akkad were now forced to operate within the imperial framework Sargon had created. The old gods remained, but their temples served a new master. With Lugalzagizi humiliated, the Akkadian horizon extended unchecked. But the seeds of that domination carried with them a hidden flaw, because when you suppress a tradition without extinguishing it, it doesn't die. It waits. Sargon may have founded the empire, but it was his grandson who dared to become a god. Naram-Sin, who ruled circa 2254 to 2218 BCE, took the imperial project to new metaphysical heights. While earlier kings had been content to call themselves servants of the gods, Naram-Sin declared himself a god, not merely favored, divine. In his victory stele, carved in pink limestone and now housed in the Louvre, Naram-Sin is shown ascending a mountain, horned helmet on his head, a symbol traditionally reserved for the gods themselves. No king had ever done this. It was a theological provocation. The Akkadian bureaucracy now worshipped its own emperor, placing him beside Enlil and Anu in state rituals. Clay tablets from Sippar and Nippur begin to refer to him as the god of Akkad. But divinity came with consequences. Naram-Sin's conquests grew increasingly violent, and his suppression of rebellions, particularly in the Zagros highlands, led to internal strife. His sacking of the sacred city of Nippur, once the dwelling of Enlil, was seen as an unforgivable transgression. The gods, once partners in kingship, now became prosecutors. In the later Sumerian king list and omen texts, a pattern begins to appear. Naram-Sin is accused of offending the divine order. One omen tablet, unearthed in the ruins of Ashur centuries later, tells of a king who became god and brought ruin. While this may reflect retroactive scorn, it also captures something deeper, the fragile edge between power and sacrilege. In the mythology of Mesopotamia, even kings were not immune to fate. To name oneself divine was to risk cosmic backlash. Empires fall not always by sword, but sometimes by silence, of rivers drying, of fields failing. Around the year 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire began to unravel. Not from a single defeat but from multiple fractures, both human and ecological. From the northeast came the Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros range, described by later Sumerians as uncultured and ignorant of the rites. The inscriptions of Utu-Hegel and later Sumerian scribes paint them as divine punishment, brutes who disrupted irrigation systems, plundered temples, and lacked knowledge of writing or agriculture. While these portrayals are likely exaggerated, the Gutian impact was real. Administrative tablets disappear from key centers. Grain stores dwindle. Regional governors go silent. But there was another enemy, less visible and far more devastating: climate change. Sediment cores and paleoclimatic studies show evidence of a prolonged drought during this period, known today as the 4.2 kiloyear event. Rainfall across the Tigris and Euphrates basins plummeted. Rivers became erratic, crop yields fell, and once prosperous agricultural centers turned into cracked earth. Cities like Tel Leilon in northern Mesopotamia were abandoned. The very land that had birthed empire could no longer sustain it. The fall of Akkad wasn't a single event. It was a slow exhale, records fading, temples looted, bureaucracies collapsing under their own weight. What remained were stories. The Sumerians would later record the curse of Akkad, a poetic lament blaming Naram-Sin's hubris for the empire's destruction. Whether cautionary tale or historical diagnosis, the message endured. No matter how high you build, even gods can be dethroned by the wind and time. The first empire fell not because it failed to conquer, but because it forgot what had built it: balance between gods and kings, earth and sky, word and silence. When kings vanish and cities lie abandoned, history doesn't just shift, it holds its breath. Enter ur-nammu and breath returns. After centuries of chaos under Gudian rule, Ur had become a ruin, its canals silted, temples desecrated, memory muted. Then came ur-nammu, who reasserted Sumerian tradition not with spectacle, but method. Over an 18-year reign, he marched through the delta not with armies of oppression, but with teams of workers restoring roads, reopening irrigation, rebuilding temples. The great ziggurat of Ur he inaugurated became both a spiritual beacon and an administrative center. Its foundation stamped with his name, rising over 30 meters toward the sky. It proclaimed quietly that Sumerian civilization lived again. Building that ziggurat was not symbolic. It was logistical mastery, moving mud brick from Adab, timber from Elam, water from canals reconstructed under royal decree. Ur-nammu also re-established Nippur's coronation rituals, declaring himself king of Sumer and Akkad, tying his legitimacy to the old gods and the old order. He did not claim divinity, an unusual restraint, but he called himself the father of orphans and protector of widows, aligning his rule with justice and restoration rather than conquest. His son Shulgi, who succeeded him in c. 2094 BCE, turned that restoration into renaissance. Shulgi reigned nearly 50 years, the longest in the Third Dynasty, codifying reforms, standardizing measures, writing new hymns praising temple rituals across Sumer. He finished construction of Ur's ziggurat and expanded the empire's scribal schools. Shulgi would eventually claim divine status for himself, a move ur-nammu avoided, but his reign reflects continuity. If ur-nammu issued the decree, Shulgi refined its meaning and its administration. In the year named ur-nammu made justice prevail, the king issued what we now call the Code of Ur-nammu, the earliest surviving law collection. Written in Sumerian around circa 2100 to 2050 BCE, only fragments remain, the prologue and some 30 of the original 57 laws. But in its tone it is revolutionary. Justice is framed as a royal duty, not vengeance. Offenses like murder, kidnapping, and adultery merit death, but most infractions carry monetary fines. Unlike the later Babylonian lex talionis, the code articulates a vision of fairness, even extending legal rights to vulnerable groups like widows and orphans. What's rare, but true, is that the code may reflect a humanitarian ethos. Penalties are proportional. Wealthy offenders pay fines rather than endure corporal punishment. Compensation is enforced rather than retribution. The prologue speaks of eliminating enmity, violence, and cries for justice from the land. This isn't typical kingly propaganda, it's legal theology, a king presenting himself as the guarantor of order rooted in divine principle. Ur-nammu's name appears stamped on bricks across Sumer, each a reminder that he built more than temples. He built legitimacy. Even in later centuries, scribes would copy his code in old-school Sumerian as a model for divine kingship. His laws would influence codes at Eshnunna, Isin, and eventually Hammurabi's Babylonian reforms. This was not merely restoration. It was transformation, using law to bind empire, memory to sustain authority, and writing to eternalize justice. Ur-nammu could not defy death. But through law, bricks, and memory, he ensured that justice endured beyond his grave. In the dust and silence of a ruined land, one structure began to rise again, stone by stone, brick by brick. It was more than a building. It was a proclamation: we have survived. The great ziggurat of Ur, begun by Ur-nammu and completed by Shulgi, was not simply the spiritual axis of a city. It was a monumental act of resurrection, built atop the remains of earlier temples, rising over 100 feet into the Mesopotamian sky. Its core, made of mud brick, was encased in baked brick stamped with the king's name, a form of propaganda, yes, but also of permanence. Each stair, each terrace, served as a symbolic ascent from earth to heaven, binding mortal and divine. British Museum tablets, excavation notes of Woolley, 1922-34. Unlike the imagined ziggurats of fantasy, the one at Ur was precise, tiered, and mathematically planned. Its 3 levels symbolized the cosmic axis: netherworld, earth, and sky. A processional stairway led priests upward in ritual movement, reenacting the connection between humans and gods. Archaeologists found colored remnants, red, black, and white pigments suggesting the structure was once vibrantly painted, not the dust-colored ruin we see today. Offerings were placed at the summit, possibly in a shrine dedicated to Nanna, the moon god of Ur and patron of the city. But this wasn't only a temple. It was a cosmic engine, a place where ritual, calendar, record-keeping, and social order converged into something transcendent. What makes the ziggurat truly rare is not its size but its survival. It remained intact for centuries, repurposed during Babylonian and later Seleucid periods. Even Alexander the Great reportedly stopped in Ur and may have offered at the site. Today it remains one of the few Sumerian structures still standing above ground, not just as memory but as testimony, etched with the fingerprints of rebirth. The ziggurat was the heart, but the arteries of empire were standardized. For Ur-nammu and especially Shulgi, rebuilding Sumer meant more than architecture. It meant consistency. Clay tablets from this period show reforms in weights and measures, calibrated down to the shekel and mina. These were not just commercial reforms, they were ideological. In an empire spanning from Elam to the Euphrates, standard units meant trust, predictability, and justice. Even bricks were uniform, often marked with dynastic seals for quality assurance. The empire was literally rebuilt on measurable order. Cuneiform Tablet MS 2272 Yale Babylonian Collection. Shulgi also expanded and systematized scribal schools, known as adubas. These were more than education centers, they were engines of cultural memory. Students learned Sumerian not just to write, but to recite hymns, copy laws, draft contracts, and preserve genealogies. In fact, Shulgi may have commissioned new versions of ancient myths to reinforce his legitimacy, including the hymns to Nanna and Utu, recast to highlight Ur's cosmic centrality. Instruction was grueling. Students copied signs over and over, often under threat of punishment, but the results were lasting. Thousands of tablets from this era survive because of these schools, making the Ur-3 period one of the best documented in all of ancient Mesopotamia. Even roads were redesigned for clarity and reach. Shulgi famously claimed to have measured the distances of my land, made the roads passable, and placed markers for the traveler. These weren't idle boasts. Archaeological surveys show a more interconnected empire under Ur-3 rule than ever before. Stations for messengers, storage for supplies, even inns for dignitaries emerged. What the Gudians had scattered, Shulgi reknit, through bureaucracy, through brick, and through the pen. From standard bricks to sacred texts, the rulers of Ur-3 did not just rebuild a city. They engineered a civilization that measured the divine in units, in law, and in verse. Beneath the dust of Puzrish Dagon, a quiet suburb of Nippur, lies what may be the most overlooked economic engine in ancient Mesopotamia. To the modern eye, the site appears modest. But the 30,000 cuneiform tablets found there tell a different story, one of unprecedented economic centralization. Known today by its Akkadian name, Drahem, this redistribution center was a logistical marvel, operated under the reign of Shulgi and his successors. Livestock flowed in, sheep, goats, oxen, and pigs, tracked meticulously in tablets that list not just the quantity, but the handlers, origins, destinations, and purposes of every transfer. In essence, Drahem was the heartbeat of the temple economy, where offerings to the gods and rations for priests were monitored with bureaucratic precision. Unlike modern market economies, this wasn't a system of supply and demand. It was a divinely sanctioned network where the gods, through their temples, owned all things and the king was their appointed manager. Animals were not sold, but allocated. A sacrificial ox in Ur could be tracked back to its birth in Drahem, its delivery approved by a named official, its death marked for a specific ritual calendar date. These weren't numbers, they were acts of cosmic balance. The redistribution center served not only Ur but other sacred cities like Nippur and Eridu, ensuring ritual continuity and social control. To miscount a goat was not just an economic error, it was a theological misalignment. Even more astonishing, some Drahem tablets show evidence of audits and corrections. Errors were reviewed and administrative oversight was routine. This was no primitive scribble, it was a functioning proto-bureaucracy, one that would later inspire similar systems under Hammurabi and even in Persian satrapies centuries later. In a civilization still recovering from the collapse of Akkad, the scribes of Drahem built a paper wall stronger than any ziggurat, a system of memory, accountability, and divine administration. What emerged under ur-nammu and Shulgi was more than recovery, it was systematization at a cultural climax. The Code of ur-nammu, composed around 2100 BCE, remains the oldest known law code, predating Hammurabi's by 3 centuries. While often overshadowed by its Babylonian descendant, this code reveals a society deeply invested in justice, but not blind punishment. Unlike Hammurabi's frequent death penalties, ur-nammu's code relied more on compensation, especially in cases of bodily injury. A broken bone? Pay silver. A false accusation? Pay a fine. Only in exceptional crimes did death appear as punishment, showing a legal system more reparative than retributive. But law wasn't just civic, it was theological. The king ruled by the will of the gods, and law was the expression of divine order. Each decree reinforced the idea that the cosmos itself had structure, and that the king's role was to mirror heaven on earth. Shulgi himself declared that he did not pervert justice for the mighty nor spare the wicked, casting himself as not only a king but an ethical intermediary between gods and men. His reign blurred the line between state and temple. Priests administered civic matters, and scribes wrote legal documents with prayers inscribed at the top. Justice in ur-3 was not just about fairness, it was about cosmic alignment. Even city planning reflects this fusion. Cities like Ur and Nippur were laid out according to ritual geographies. Temples faced specific celestial orientations. Courtrooms were adjacent to sanctuaries, and gates bore names that referenced divine judgment. This was not merely urban planning, it was cosmolegal cartography where geography, politics, and theology coexisted in every brick and road. But perhaps nowhere is this fusion more hauntingly alive than in the royal hymns of Shulgi himself. Over 30 hymns attributed to his reign survive. many written in the first person, with Shulgi portraying himself not just as king, but as scholar, athlete, scribe, priest, and even divine being. In one, he boasts of running from Nippur to Ur in a single day to oversee rituals in both cities, a nearly 200-mile round trip. Was this literal? Likely not. But as mythic autobiography, it was potent. The king was not simply a ruler. He was the living embodiment of civilization's perfection. Shulgi's hymns were propaganda, yes, but they were also education. Students copied them in scribal schools. Priests recited them during state rituals. Citizens heard them in processions. The king's persona was etched into collective consciousness. In one passage he declares, "I am the scribe of all scribes, the shepherd who knows his sheep." These are not just metaphors. They reflect a society where the literary king was as valued as the warrior king. In Shulgi's Ur, the pen was the altar. Perhaps most revealing, one hymn compares Shulgi to a lion and a lamb, a storm and a sunbeam. He could rage in battle, yet sing in the temple. He could impose taxes, yet write poetry. This duality wasn't contradiction, it was expectation. A Sumerian king had to be everything at once: economic administrator, military protector, divine intercessor, and cultural icon. Shulgi embraced this role with such theatrical flair that later kings, including Hammurabi and even Assyrian monarchs, copied his hymn style, mimicking his divine claims centuries later. In Shulgi's Ur, the divine was not separate from the daily. It lived in the ledger, the courtroom, the verse, and the stone. Civilization was not just rebuilt. It was reimagined, with memory, ritual, and law converging into a single luminous vision. What does it mean when a civilization dies, but its voice is kept alive by strangers? The death of a language is not silence. It is memory, carved in clay but no longer heard aloud. The last king of Ur, Ibbi-Sin, reigned as if the world around him hadn't already started crumbling. The ziggurat still stood. Rituals still echoed through temple courtyards. Scribes still pressed cuneiform into clay. But beyond the walls of Ur, the land of Sumer had begun to fracture, not by rebellion but by erosion. Like a river changing its course, history had started to flow elsewhere. The Elamites came first, not with massive armies but with persistent pressure. They struck from the east, looting temples, disrupting trade routes, and destabilizing the cities that had once sent offerings to the moon god Nana. Then came the Amorites, a wave of Semitic-speaking nomads who didn't batter walls but seeped into Sumer like groundwater, settling first as shepherds and traders, later as kings. They didn't conquer Ur in a single battle. They simply waited it out. The Sumerians by this time were exhausted, politically fractured, ecologically strained, and reliant on an administrative system too rigid to adapt. In a tablet discovered near the site of Nippur, a high-ranking official of the era laments, "The grain has failed, the storehouses are silent, the enemies circle like dogs." These are not metaphors. The Euphrates shifted, salinization ruined fields, and nomadic movements threatened urban supply lines. The once mighty economic engine of Drahem sputtered to a stop. Bureaucratic correspondence slowed. Temples could no longer pay their priests. Kings were dethroned not by force, but by the collapse of the systems that supported them. The fall of Ur wasn't the end of cities, but the end of a worldview. As Ur-3 declined, another city, modest and obscure until then, began to rise: Babylon. Under Sumobum, an Amorite chieftain turned local ruler, Babylon's foundations were laid, not just physically but ideologically. It did not attempt to revive Sumerian order. Instead, it began to absorb and reinvent. The rituals, laws, and even the scribal traditions of Ur were not discarded. They were translated. Babylon's rise was not a military miracle. but a cultural realignment. The city did not speak Sumerian as its mother tongue. It spoke Akkadian. Scribes began copying Sumerian texts not for daily use, but for preservation. Sumerian, now a dead language, became sacred. In the same way Latin would be preserved in monasteries long after Roman armies fell, Sumerian became a language of gods and scholars, a ritual tongue, not a spoken one. In palace archives and temple schools, students were trained to memorize the myths of Gilgamesh, the hymns of Enheduanna, the laws of ur-nammu, not as functional tools, but as echoes of a world that had passed. The Eduba, or scribal school, now taught Sumerian like a foreign language. Young scribes memorized Sumerian word lists beside their Akkadian counterparts, not to communicate but to remember. The survival of Sumerian was not organic. It was archival. This shift, from living culture to literary relic, marks one of the most haunting transitions in ancient history. The Sumerians didn't just disappear. They were canonized. Their gods, cities, and kings were folded into the mythological framework of Babylon. Enlil still had his temple at Nippur. Nana was still worshipped at Ur. But their stories were retold through Amorite voices, reshaped for new kings who traced their legitimacy through borrowed greatness. Even more fascinating, later kings, like Hammurabi centuries later, invoked the names of Sumerian rulers like ur-nammu and Shulgi in their own inscriptions. They didn't see themselves as destroyers of the past. They saw themselves as its heirs. To rule Mesopotamia, one didn't just need soldiers. One needed scrolls. Legacy became a weapon more powerful than chariots. Archaeological digs at Sippar, Mari, and Babylon revealed tablets that were copies of copies, duplicated centuries after the fall of Ur. One tablet of the instructions of Shuruppak was copied at least 400 years after its original composition. It's as if the scribes knew what was fading, and refused to let it vanish. And in doing so they invented a new category of memory: cultural immortality. The fall of a city is not the end of a people. It is the beginning of a story retold in foreign tongues. Sumer died, but not quietly. Its ziggurats still pierced the sky. Its names were etched in laws, prayers, and poems. Its language became a whisper in the corridors of time, carried not by its own children, but by those who came after, who remembered just enough to reshape it. It is not the fall of walls that signals the end of a civilization. It is the last time someone speaks its language and is understood. The death of a language doesn't happen like the fall of a king. It does not break, it fades. And for Sumerian, that fading was long, uneven, and eerily quiet. While cities burned and dynasties rose and collapsed, Sumerian drifted slowly from daily use. First in markets, then in households, and finally in the minds of children who no longer learned it from their parents. Somewhere in this uncertain gap, between bureaucracy and birthright, the last native Sumerian speakers died. Their names are unknown. No stone marks the moment. But linguistically they were the end of a living world. By the time of the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, Sumerian had already transitioned into a language of ritual and record, not conversation. A rare tablet from Sippar contains a legal contract written in Akkadian but annotated in Sumerian, a sign that scribes still revered the old language even as they moved on. The Eduba, or scribal schools, taught Sumerian as a dead tongue, wrote memorization, lexical lists, and grammatical drills. It wasn't for speech. It was for ceremony and memory. Yet this wasn't mere nostalgia. The Babylonians believed Sumerian was the language of the gods. It had been used to speak to Enlil, Inanna, and Nana, to perform rituals, compose hymns, and bind law codes. To abandon it completely would have been seen as sacrilege. So they kept it alive, not to live in it, but to recite it. In much the same way that Latin persisted in medieval churches, Sumerian became the sacred grammar of the divine. The voices of Enheduanna and Shulgi still echoed, but only through the lips of students who would never speak Sumerian to their own children. Identifying the last native speakers of Sumerian is like tracing the final flicker of a dying flame. No one wrote, "Today we stop speaking Sumerian." But linguistic analysis and archival evidence hint at the slow transition. The administrative texts from the late UR3 period, once entirely in Sumerian, begin to favor Akkadian more heavily by the 20th century BCE. While Sumerian remained in religious and legal texts, everyday letters, receipts, and contracts began to default to Akkadian. It wasn't conquest that killed Sumerian. It was convenience. And yet, the last generation of fluent native Sumerian speakers likely lived in places like Nippur and Uruk, two cities that remained bastions of scribal learning. These individuals were probably not kings or generals, but priests, temple singers, and teachers. Their spoken Sumerian may have sounded worn, preserved like a fossil, full of older constructions not used in daily speech. But for a time they carried both the old grammar and the living breath of the first written language in human history. In a quiet irony, the preservation of Sumerian as a ritual language may have ensured its extinction as a native tongue. By institutionalizing it, they dislocated it from the home. Parents no longer passed it down. Instead, state institutions did, imperfectly, rigidly, and exclusively. The result was not cultural collapse, but a linguistic quarantine. Sumerian didn't vanish, it was embalmed. The transformation of Sumerian into a liturgical and scholarly language created a strange afterlife for it. Though no one spoke it natively by 1700 BCE, thousands of tablets continued to be written in it over the following centuries. Students of the Old Babylonian period practiced copying Sumerian hymns, royal inscriptions, and law codes, not because they understood every word, but because memorizing Sumerian texts was a rite of passage into the scribal elite. In this way, the dead language became a tool of class distinction. To be a proper scribe, to serve in temples or courts, one had to master Sumerian, even if no one else could understand it. The language became an elite code, not unlike how Greek philosophy would later be studied in Latin, or Sanskrit hymns recited without direct translation. The mastery of Sumerian was not about communication, it was about prestige and piety. And yet, even in its death, Sumerian endured with astonishing resilience. As late as 500 BCE, scholars in Babylon and even Assyria were still referencing Sumerian word lists and signs. A clay tablet from this period contains a trilingual dictionary, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Aramaic. Think about that. A language that had been extinct for over a millennium was still considered vital enough to be included in linguistic training. This wasn't nostalgia. This was reverence. A language doesn't die when it is no longer spoken. It dies when it is no longer remembered. But Sumerian was remembered. It was catalogued, drilled, preserved. Not by the children of Sumer, but by the civilizations that inherited its bones. By the time the Persians ruled Babylon and Alexander the Great stared at the ruins of Uruk, Sumerian had long been silent. Yet its script, structure, and myths lived on, copied by scholars who may never have heard it aloud but still believed it mattered. The language that first taught the world how to write contracts, hymns, and histories now lived not in breath, but in stone and clay. And there it waited, waiting for the day thousands of years later when archaeologists and epigraphers would decode the symbols, listen between the lines, and hear the echoes of the first voice ever etched in earth. The people were gone. The tongue was silent. But the memory, they refused to let it die. When a language vanishes from the lips of a people, it usually disappears into oblivion. But Sumerian defied that fate, not through its native speakers but through its conquerors. The Akkadian scribes, inheritors of Sumer's clay libraries and temple secrets, became its unlikely preservers. Though the Akkadians spoke and wrote in their own Semitic tongue, they treated Sumerian not as an artifact of the past, but as a sacred archive. They copied it, studied it, and passed it down for centuries. This was no mere academic exercise. The scribes saw themselves not as mere translators, but curators of a divine language. Across Mesopotamia, they compiled lexical lists, bilingual tablets, and grammatical treatises, some even going as far as to produce long dictionaries of Sumerian-Akkadian equivalents. At Nippur and Sippar, temple schools generated thousands of practice tablets where young students copied out Sumerian myths, proverbs, and royal inscriptions. It wasn't just about literacy. It was about legacy. This quiet act of preservation, conducted in back rooms of temples, schoolyards of future bureaucrats, and dimly lit scribal libraries, was a form of cultural resistance against amnesia. By standardizing Sumerian forms and texts, the Akkadian scribes gave it an afterlife. A fragile, artificial, but persistent one. They couldn't speak it fluently, but they could keep its words moving forward across the centuries until future hands, ours, could find them again in the dust. From the hundreds of oral stories that once animated Sumerian hearths and festivals, only a few were chosen to survive the transition. These stories were not merely copied, they were canonized, selected, edited, and written onto clay in forms that would define them for millennia. Among them, three rose above the rest: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns of Inanna, and the Sumerian creation myths. The Epic of Gilgamesh did not begin as a unified story. It began as scattered tales in Sumerian, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh and Huwawa, Gilgamesh in the Netherworld. But the Akkadian scribes, especially in the Old Babylonian period, began to weave these into a narrative arc. They added connective tissue, expanded characters, and infused deeper philosophical reflections. It was no longer just a story of a hero, it was a story of grief, failure, and the impossible search for immortality. A king who could not be saved, but whose name would outlast every dynasty that followed him. Equally significant were the hymns to Inanna, many of which are attributed to Enheduanna, the high priestess of Ur and the world's first known named author. Her devotional poetry was copied and revered long after her city fell. Inanna was no gentle goddess, she was war, passion, cosmos, chaos. Her stories were preserved not just for theology, but because they pulsed with poetic intensity that captivated even the scribes of later ages. In these verses, one finds the deep emotional vocabulary of ancient power and pain. And then there were the creation myths, texts like Enki and the World Order, and the debate between sheep and grain, which offered not just cosmogony, but economic and political ideologies disguised as fable. These texts didn't just survive because they explained origins, they survived because they explained systems. Why cities should be ruled, why gods deserve offerings, why humans must labor. These stories gave structure to society that made them irreplaceable. To canonize literature is to decide what the future will remember. And for the Akkadian scribes and priests who guarded the clay archives of a dead language, this act was a form of resistance against oblivion. They could not stop the Amorite invasions, nor the Elamite campaigns that toppled the final Sumerian cities. But they could select which stories would speak through the rubble. The scribes were not mere copyists. They were engineers of cultural continuity. In the wake of civil collapse and linguistic extinction, they became the final firewall between the past and nothingness. Their tablets were more than archives. They were monuments, etched not in marble but in fragile clay. And the effort to protect them was not casual. Libraries in Uruk, Nippur, and Babylon maintained strict protocols for preservation. Some were stored in sealed jars, others buried in walls. A few were even hidden in underground vaults, away from the fires of conquest. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a belief that memory mattered more than survival. The kings of Ur had long since vanished. Their ziggurats crumbled. Their laws forgotten by the people who now lived on their streets. But their voices, through the hands of scribes, remained. In that sense, the death of Sumerian was not a disappearance. It was a rebirth in ritualized memory. As one later Babylonian text would quietly muse, written in the shadow of a forgotten people. What has been written cannot be unmade. They disappeared. But their fingerprints are on everything. Long before Plato dreamt of Atlantis, before the pyramids crowned Egypt, and centuries before the Bible would be written down, there were the Sumerians. Most people today can't name a Sumerian king or locate Ur on a map. Yet we live every day in a world shaped by their invisible architecture. They didn't set out to build a legacy, but they built one anyway. Not through conquest or monuments, but by crafting the invisible scaffolding of civilization itself. What did they leave behind? The answer is not a single artifact or building. It's an entire toolkit for human progress. Writing systems, laws, literature, science, cities, religion, concepts so foundational that we forget they had to be invented. It began with grain. The first signs carved into clay weren't stories or poems. They were inventories, barley shipments, oxen counts, tallies of workers and temple offerings. These humble tokens and notched tablets, by necessity, evolved into cuneiform, the world's earliest true writing system. A wedge pushed into wet clay became a syllable. A symbol became a name. And soon the Sumerians weren't just recording, they were remembering. The leap from counting to storytelling is one of the great pivots in human history. It allowed for the transmission of knowledge not bound by memory. For the first time, humans could send words into the future. They created not just a script, but the idea that speech could become permanent. This was the beginning of literature, contracts, bureaucracy, and history. All because a Sumerian scribe wanted to make sure someone got paid for a shipment of fish. By 2600 BCE, cuneiform had more than 1,000 signs. Yet it remained adaptable, malleable to different languages, eras, and uses. It would be borrowed and retooled by Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, Elamites. For nearly 3,000 years, it remained the writing of empires, all rooted in a system developed to record barley in a Sumerian temple storeroom. Before Hammurabi carved his famous code into stone, the Sumerians had already pioneered legal systems based on precedent and royal authority. The Code of Ur-nammu, written around 2100 BCE, is the oldest known legal code in human history. It didn't just list punishments. It defined categories of wrongdoing, bodily harm, property disputes, theft, and adultery, with fixed penalties and compensations. But the real innovation wasn't the laws, it was the assumption behind them, that justice should be written down, standardized, and made public. The Sumerians introduced the idea that a king was not simply a warlord, but a guardian of fairness, guided by divine mandate. These weren't abstract values. They were written into administrative structures, with judges appointed at every level of society, and contracts sealed by witness tablets. In a society of fast-growing cities and complex economies, this legal code was a tool of social cohesion. It prevented the rise of local tyrants and guaranteed that rights, however limited, could be claimed by the weak against the strong. The legal bureaucracy created by the Sumerians would be copied and refined by every great power that came after them. Literature, as we know it today, is a direct descendant of Sumerian clay. Their stories were not just entertainment. They were rituals, cosmologies, and philosophical explorations etched into the earth itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns to Inanna, the Sumerian flood myth, and dialogues like the dispute between sheep and grain weren't just tales. They were lenses on what it meant to be human. The Sumerians did something extraordinary. They made stories timeless. They took the ephemeral, grief, longing, power, death, and gave it permanence. They taught that kings could die in despair, that gods were not always just, that even the greatest among us feared what lay beyond the grave. It was raw, often uncomfortable, and always deeply human. Their myths were later adapted by the Babylonians, and elements can be traced into the Hebrew Bible, Greek epics, and modern literature. The themes they explored, mortality, friendship, fate, still resonate. Their literature became the first mirror humanity ever held up to itself, and we have never stopped looking. To manage irrigation, temples, and calendars, the Sumerians had to become scientists. They invented a base 60-number system. Yes, the same system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. They tracked stars, mapped lunar cycles, and developed almanacs for agriculture. Their clay tablets reveal a grasp of mathematics far beyond what was once thought possible for the time. One Sumerian tablet contains a nearly perfect Pythagorean triple, inscribed a millennium before Pythagoras was born. Their geometry and surveying tools enabled the building of canals, boundaries, and temples. The Sumerians didn't separate math from religion. To them, numbers were divine, a language the gods used to describe the world. Their astronomy wasn't just observational. It formed the foundation of timekeeping and calendar systems used across Mesopotamia and later in the Hellenistic world. By watching the skies and codifying the cycles of the moon, the Sumerians turned cosmic chaos into predictable order. That is science in its purest form. When people speak of the cradle of civilization, they're speaking of Uruk, Lagash, Ur, and Eridu, Sumerian cities that redefined what human settlement could be. These weren't just clusters of huts. They were complex, multi-zoned urban environments with administrative quarters, residential districts, workshops, ziggurats, and marketplaces, all laid out according to ritual and function. Cities became more than places to live. They became expressions of cosmic order. The temple was always central, often aligned with cardinal directions. Streets were planned. Canals were regulated. Warehouses, archives, schools, and housing were integrated in ways that reveal a stunning degree of civil engineering. Most striking was the Sumerian invention of the city as an institution, not just a location but a legal and religious body. A city like Uruk had its own deities, economic policies, and diplomatic relations. It issued receipts. It set grain prices. It enforced contracts. It was, in essence, the earliest version of a city-state, a form of governance that would ripple outward for millennia. More than anything else, the Sumerians institutionalized the divine. Religion was not private, it was public, material, and economic. The temple was a government office, a granary, a school, and a court of law. Gods had staff. They had land. They had budgets. And they had calendars filled with sacrificial rituals, festivals, and political ceremonies. Priests weren't just spiritual figures, they were bureaucrats, astronomers, economists, and judges. The temple controlled labor, issued wages, regulated weights, and collected taxes in the name of the gods. Temples even employed their own merchants, who acted on behalf of divine patronage. In some cities, over half the population was economically tied to the temple in some way. This tight fusion of religion and bureaucracy gave rise to theocracy as an administrative system. It also laid the groundwork for later empires where divine authority justified rule, not just in Mesopotamia but in Egypt, Persia, and Rome. The gods were not above the system. They were the system. We rarely think about the fact that the shape of our hours, the design of our contracts, the grammar of our laws, and the structure of our cities all emerged from a vanished people whose language no one speaks. But the Sumerians are with us still. They built a world not of empires or monuments, but of ideas. They did not know what they were inventing, but they knew they were recording something for the future. And that instinct, to write, to organize, to question, to preserve, was the seed of everything that followed. Their names may be lost, but their thoughts still move through the veins of civilization. Some cultures dream of their legacy. Others leave one behind without meaning to. The Sumerians never called themselves that. The name Sumer is an outsider's label imposed much later. What they knew was the land they walked, Kiangur, the land of the noble lords. They didn't build with marble, nor carve their names into mountain faces. They worked with mud, ephemeral, fragile, quick to crumble. And yet, somehow their ideas outlasted the empires built on stone. This final hour is not about kings or battles. It is about echoes, how a people vanished but kept speaking through the civilizations that followed, through laws, languages, and time itself. By the time Babylon rose to power in the 18th century BCE, Sumer was already memory, but a memory deeply rooted. Hammurabi's law code borrowed heavily from Sumerian legal templates like ur-nammus. Babylonian scribes copied Sumerian hymns, flood myths, and epic cycles, editing and adapting them into the Akkadian canon. Even Marduk, Babylon's patron god, gained stature using theological blueprints drawn centuries earlier from Enlil and Enki. In Assyria, the echoes became institutional. Sumerian city administration inspired Assyrian provincial bureaucracy. Assyrian kings recorded omens in clay, consulted scribes before war, and laid bricks under sacred formulas, rituals first invented in temples at Nippur and Ur. Ashurbanipal's famous library at Nineveh? It was filled with Sumerian originals, meticulously preserved as if guarding the mind of a civilization long gone. Even Egypt, so geographically distinct, did not remain untouched. Contacts through trade and military friction brought fragments of Sumerian knowledge, especially calendrical and astronomical systems, into Egyptian royal court circles. Meanwhile, Mesopotamian cosmologies, including creation through ordered chaos, would find their way into later Semitic traditions, including the Hebrew Bible. The Sumerian flood story with Utnapishtim and his boat of survivors predates Noah by nearly 1,000 years. These aren't just coincidences. They are fossils of thought, carried forward by scholars, conquerors, priests, and scribes who knew that they were not starting fresh, but standing on something ancient. There's a quiet irony here. The more modern we become, the more Sumerian our daily lives resemble. Most people today don't realize they're living in a world shaped by river priests and city scribes, but the signs are everywhere. Take time. Our hours are divided into 60 minutes, circles into 360 degrees. This sexagesimal system, invented by Sumerians for tracking celestial movements and harvest cycles, now governs our clocks, compasses, and GPS satellites. When your alarm goes off at 7 a.m., you're responding to a system designed to track the moon over Uruk's skyline. Or look at school. The world's first formal education system emerged in Sumer, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for training bureaucrats. Young boys, often the sons of temple officials, sat in idubas, tablet houses, reciting cuneiform lists and copying myths. Their curriculum? Sumerian language, accounting, law, and divine hymns. Fast forward 4,000 years and students still sit in rows, reciting from memory, graded on scripts. Law and taxes? The first receipts ever written down were on clay tablets. The first tax records? Fish deliveries to a temple kitchen. The first lawsuit? A man claiming he was sold bad barley. We laugh at bureaucracy today, But Sumer invented it not out of cruelty but necessity. Their cities were too complex, their people too diverse, to survive without structured, impartial administration. In short, we live Sumerian lives without knowing it. They didn't just create cities. They created habits. Even the ruins lie to us, quiet in the desert, whispering of splendor we can't fully grasp. But make no mistake, these cities, Ur, Eridu, Uruk, were once the throbbing center of human consciousness. Uruk, the birthplace of writing and Gilgamesh, stretched across 250 hectares at its height. Its great white temple to Anu shimmered in sunlight, plastered in gleaming gypsum. A city of ziggurats and wide canals, Uruk wasn't just big, it was unprecedented. Eridu, older still, was called the first city by the Sumerians themselves, sacred to Enki and thick with myth. Ur, the burial place of kings, held treasure graves that stunned the 20th century archaeologists who opened them. Yet it wasn't gold that mattered most, it was structure. The ziggurat of Ur wasn't just a temple, it was an axis between earth and cosmos, a man-made mountain pointing to the heavens. Its very design, terraces, stairs, orientation, was based on cosmic order. When the ruins were unearthed in the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley described them not as ancient, but as alien in their completeness. But time does what time always does. It buries, breaks, and erases. And yet, these cities, though ruined, are not forgotten. The mud brick is gone, but the thought it held is not. The memory remains, fossilized in tablets, echoed in epics, trapped in the architecture of our minds. And so we end not with collapse but with continuity. The Sumerians never ruled the world. They never built empires that stretched across continents. But they did something far stranger, they built ideas so solid they could outlive buildings. While bronze rusted and kings fell, Sumerian thought kept migrating, from city to city, language to language, until it no longer needed to be Sumerian. It became civilization itself. They started with mud. That was all they had. And yet from that river mud they made laws, poems, contracts, prayers, and dreams. What is more human than that? So when you look at a clock, read a book, walk into a courthouse, or pay your taxes, spare a thought for a people whose names are mostly lost, whose tombs are mostly broken, but whose minds still move through our world like ghosts in the foundation. We do not know the face of the last native Sumerian speaker. But we know this, they did not vanish. They became part of us. They lived in cities we've buried, wrote in scripts we no longer speak, and prayed to gods we do not remember. Yet their dreams, their tools, and their questions still live in us. The Sumerians never vanished. They became us. If the ancient Sumerians taught us anything, it's that no idea is too fragile, no invention too small, no voice too early. They wrote on clay not expecting to be remembered. And yet here we are, reading their thoughts, feeling their fears, and echoing their questions. So before you move on, ask yourself, what are we leaving behind, not in stone but in mind? If you found meaning in their story, subscribe to uncover more lost worlds, comment to share your thoughts, and tell us, what legacy do you think we're building now? Because memory is fragile. And history only lives as long as someone chooses to remember. Thank you for watching.